Fire, small, but enough to take the whole barn. She stood in the dark and did not scream, did not run. Just 4 buckets. Would it be enough? It had to be. Because inside that barn, 6 weeks from now, a mare was carrying the one thing that could save everything. When the fire died, she found it. A piece of oilcloth, dark red, caught on the fence post nearest the burn. She knew that color, she had seen it before. On the saddle of the most respected man in town. Wyoming 1884. Some things don't die from the cold. They die because someone arranged for them to die one by one in silence on purpose. And some women arrive on the last train of the year. Uninvited, unexpected, carrying nothing but a dead man's satchel and the kind of knowledge that does not appear on any official document, but is in the end the only thing that cannot be taken. The train did not slow the way Ruth Calloway expected a train to slow when it was carrying someone toward a new life. It slowed the way all trains slowed, grinding and indifferent. Like the locomotive had no opinion about what waited on the other side of the doors, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She gripped the leather handle of her father's satchel and did not let herself look out the window until the platform appeared. Then she looked, because that was the kind of woman she was. The kind who looked at things directly even when looking hurt. Rawlins, Wyoming, November 1884. Gray. All of it gray. The sky the color of old pewter and the platform boards, weathered to the color of ash, and the faces of the people standing near the depot, the color of people who had been outside in November, wind long enough to stop caring what color they were. The wind off the flats hit the side of the train car before the wheels had fully stopped, and Ruth felt it even through the window glass. Felt the particular pressure of it against the pane, the kind of wind that does not introduce itself before putting its hands on you. She stood, straightened her wool skirt, the dark blue one she had chosen that morning, in the thin gray light of the Dodge City boarding house because it was the warmest thing she owned that wasn't a blanket. Buttoned the top button of her fitted vest, adjusted the narrow brim of her felt hat until it sat exactly where it needed to sit, which was low enough to mean business, and high enough to still be considered respectable by the kind of women who kept track of such things. She did not know yet whether Rawlins contained those women. She suspected it did. Every town she had ever been in had contained those women. They were apparently abundant on the frontier, like juniper and moral certainty. The porter had moved on to someone more visibly in need by the time Ruth reached the bottom of the platform steps. She carried the trunk herself, both handles leaning slightly to counterbalance, elbows bent at the particular angle of someone who had learned that asking for help was slower than just doing the thing. The satchel hung on her right shoulder. Her father's satchel, brown leather gone soft at the corners. The brass clasp replaced twice, the strap repaired with a piece of harness leather that did not quite match but held. Inside, bandage linen wrapped tight, a glass bottle of carbolic acid nested in wool, a small case of brass instruments she had carried since the clinic in Dodge City. The case had belonged to Thomas first. She had borrowed it 2 weeks after the funeral because the alternative was leaving it on the shelf where it would have just sat there being his. She had stopped borrowing it at some point. She could not have said exactly when it became hers. These things do not announce themselves. The platform smelled of coal smoke and frozen mud and the particular animal smell of a livestock town that had decided not to be embarrassed about being a livestock town. Ruth breathed it in and filed it away. She was in the habit of filing things away. It was a useful habit for a woman in her position. Her position being alone, 36 years old, in possession of one trunk, one satchel, and a set of skills that did not appear on any official document, but had nonetheless kept her employed and fed for the better part of 3 years. She saw the man before he saw her. He was leaning against the side of a buckboard near the livery at the end of the platform road, and he was looking at the train itself, not at the passengers disembarking, which was either a sign of genuine indifference or a careful performance of indifference, and she could not yet tell which. He was tall in the way of men who had spent decades working and not thinking about their posture. His coat was canvas, not wool, which meant either he ran warm or he did not believe in accommodating the cold. His hat was a Stetson gone soft at the crown, the brim shaped by years of being grabbed in the same spots by the same hand. The kind of hat that had opinions. The kind of hat that had been broken in so thoroughly it was now less an object and more an extension of the person wearing it. He straightened when she walked toward him, took the hat off, which told her someone had once taught him manners. put it back on, which told her he had decided manners were beside the point now. Not rudeness, just practicality. There was a difference between the two, and most people did not bother to make it. "You're the one who answered the notice." Not a question. The voice was low and even and did not waste syllables on niceties it did not intend to follow through on. "I am." Ruth set her trunk down on the frozen ground because the alternative was continuing to hold it while they established themselves as people who existed, and she had already established herself as a person who existed. She had been doing it for 36 years. Wade Callister looked at her the way she had come to expect to be looked at in the years since Thomas died. The accounting. Quick, practiced, not unkind. Taking in what she was and adjusting expectation accordingly. The difference between Wade and most of the men who had looked at her that way in the past 3 years was that his expectation did not appear to adjust in either direction. He did not seem disappointed. He did not seem relieved. He just looked, and then he nodded, and then he bent and picked up her trunk with one hand and put it in the back of the buckboard without asking whether she wanted help with it, which was not, strictly speaking, asking for her preference. But it was not condescension either. It was just a man who had decided that standing there holding his hat while a woman managed a heavy trunk alone was a worse use of everyone's time than simply picking up the trunk. She could work with that. She climbed up onto the buckboard seat and arranged her skirt over her knees and looked out at Rawlins while he came around to take the reins. The town had the specific quality of a place that had expected to be more than it was, and had arrived at a kind of truce with its own ambitions. There was a hotel, 2 stories, with a sign that had been repainted recently enough to still look optimistic, a general store, a telegraph office, 2 saloons that she could see from here, and probably a third around a corner somewhere. A church at the far end of the main road, white clapboard, small enough to suggest that God was considered optional in Rawlins, and the church was there mostly as a suggestion. Then there was the man at the end of the platform. She noticed him the way she noticed most things that did not want to be noticed. He was standing near the depot wall, not in line for anything, not waiting for anyone in any visible way. Beaver felt hat, new. Wool vest the color of dark moss, fitted precisely, imported, the kind of town merchant didn't stock, had to be ordered. Boots with a shine that had no business surviving a Wyoming November. He was watching the arriving passengers with the particular quality of attention that looks like casual interest and is actually inventory. His eyes moved to the buckboard when Wade picked up her trunk, moved to Ruth when she climbed up to the seat, stayed there for a beat longer than was quite comfortable. Then he tipped his hat, slowly, the elaborate courtesy of a man who wanted you to understand that he was being courteous. Ruth looked away first, not because she was unnerved, because looking away first was a choice she could make, and she preferred to make choices before they were made for her. Wade clicked his tongue and the horses moved. The platform fell behind them. The road out of Rawlins was 2 hours of frozen ruts and a sky that pressed down on the plains like something tired. The land was enormous and flat and golden gray with dead grass, and here and there a stand of cottonwoods near where a creek would be in spring. The horizon was so far away it stopped looking like a boundary and started looking like a proposition. Ruth had grown up in Indiana, where the land was organized into rectangles, and there were trees enough to give you the impression the world had edges. This was different. This land did not believe in edges. Wade Callister said what he said in pieces. The way a man opens a door and waits to see what the air on the other side feels like before deciding how far to push it. Cold Ridge Ranch was 7 miles from town. He had been running horses there for 11 years, since before his father died and left him the land and the debt and the particular set of obligations that came with both. The bloodlines were good, or they had been. 40 animals currently, down from 48. Past 2 seasons had been difficult. Ruth waited. He'd lost 6 horses since September. 4 of the breeding mares, the ones that mattered most to the operation. The others, a 5-year-old gelding of solid stock and a mare in her prime that had been the most reliable producer he had. Dr. Owen Tate, who had been the territorial veterinarian in Rawlins for going on 9 years, had been out twice and said 2 different things, and neither thing had helped. She asked what the animals had been doing before they died. Coughing at first, he said, then fever in some of them. Then they stopped eating, and after that it was quick. She asked how the stalls were arranged in relation to each other, whether the sick animals had been grouped. He looked at her. Stalls are stalls. Which direction does the main barn face? He took his time answering. She could see him deciding whether the question was the kind worth humoring. He had the face of a man who had asked himself that question about a lot of things over a long period of time. North. The big doors open north. She filed that away and said nothing else about the barn, not because there was nothing else to say. Because the barn was something she would need to see with her own eyes before saying anything worth saying. And she had learned years ago that talking too early about what you suspected made people defensive before you had the information to back it up. Thomas had taught her that. He had been a doctor who talked too early, and he had been right more often than not, and it had still cost him more than it needed to, because being right is only half of the problem. The other half is being believed. The ranch came into view from a low rise, and she took it in without making it obvious that she was taking it in. The house was 2 stories, white clapboard that had gone to cream with weather, a covered porch along the front with a post on the left end that needed replacing. The barn was large, well constructed, the kind of structure that had real money behind it at the beginning, before the beginning had hardened into the long middle of maintaining a thing. There was a corral off the east side of the barn. There were horses in it, she counted without seeming to count, 6 of them at the far rail, and even from the rise, even with the buckboard still jolting on the ruts, she could see how they were standing. Heads down, weight shifted back, the particular stillness of animals that have learned that movement costs more than it returns. She watched them until the buckboard dropped off the rise, and the angle of the hill took them from sight. Silas Monk came out of the barn when they pulled into the yard, moving with the particular economy of a man who had decided long ago how much energy each task was worth, and had stopped spending more than that. He was perhaps 52 with a frame that had once been heavier, and had reduced itself to what the work actually required. His left knee gave with each step in a way that was clearly old and had been old for a long time, the kind of injury that had been refused treatment at some point early on, and had settled into permanence as a result. He wore a faded flannel shirt gone thin at the elbows, a leather apron cracked along one edge, boots with the toes worn square. His hat was wide-brimmed cotton canvas with the sweat stain at the band that told her he had been wearing it through many seasons and saw no reason to change that now. He looked at Ruth, then at Wade, then at Ruth again. She's smaller than I figured. Not hostile. Just honest in the way of a person who has stopped seeing a reason to be otherwise. Something in Ruth settled into place, the way it always did when someone said exactly what they were thinking without dressing it up. She had always found honesty easier to work with than performance, even when the honesty was unflattering. The horses won't care. Something shifted in Silas's expression, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. He folded the rag he'd been holding and tucked it into his apron pocket, and that was the extent of the introduction, which suited Ruth just fine. The room they gave her was off the back of the house, past the kitchen, east-facing window, a hook on the back of the door, a braided rug on the plank floor, made from fabric strips in different shades of brown and red, the kind of rug that takes a very long time and steady hands and someone who cared about the finished thing. She put her trunk at the foot of the cot, hung her second dress on the hook, set her father's satchel on the floor within reach of the bed, low and to the left, where she could find it in the dark without having to think about it. She had done this in 7 different rooms in 3 years. The arrangement was always the same because the arrangement was the one that worked, and there was no reason to spend energy inventing a new one in every new place. Through the east window the light was fading. What remained of the afternoon was thin and gray and useful for approximately another 20 minutes. She could hear Wade somewhere in the back of the house, boots on floorboards, the sound of a door. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and something Silas had left simmering on the stove. Beans and salt meat adequate. She ate at the kitchen table, with Silas and Wade in the particular silence of people who have not yet established what kind of conversation they are going to have with each other, and have made a collective decision to wait. The food was enough. The coffee was strong. The lamplight was yellow and steady, and made the kitchen feel smaller than it was, which was not a bad thing. Wade told her the books were in the study and needed attention. He told her meals had been whatever Silas could put together. He told her the room was hers for as long as the arrangement suited them both. The same phrase from the notice. She had decided when she read it the first time that it was the phrase of an honest person. And sitting across from him at the table she thought she had been right, which was a relief, because she had not always been right about people, and the times she had been wrong had cost her considerably. She finished her coffee and set the cup down, looked out the window, which showed her nothing but her own reflection and the dark beyond it. Then she pushed her chair back, took her coat from the peg by the kitchen door, and went out to the barn. The cold hit her like a wall with opinions. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since they'd pulled in from Rawlins, and the sky had cleared the way Wyoming skies clear in November, all the clouds gone and the stars appearing suddenly in their thousands, bright and cold, and offering no warmth whatsoever. She pulled her coat tighter and walked across the frozen ground toward the barn door, her boots crunching on the rime of frost that had formed on the grass since sundown. The barn door was heavy but balanced on its hinges. She pushed it open enough to slip inside and pulled it closed behind her. The temperature inside was better than outside. Not warm. But the accumulated heat of 40 horses in a closed space made the difference between cold you could work in and cold you could not. A single lantern hung from a hook near the door, turned low, putting out just enough light to see by. She stood in the middle of the main aisle and did not move for a full minute. Just let her eyes adjust and her other senses sort themselves out. The horses she could see nearest the door were fine. 3 of them, in the first 2 stalls on the left, young animals with the easy stance of things that had not yet encountered a reason to hold themselves differently. Their eyes were clear in the lantern light, their heads up at a natural angle, 2 of them chewing methodically on their last feed of the evening, with the bovine contentment of animals that are doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing, at the exact time they are supposed to be doing it. She walked further in. The barn was long. The stalls ran down both sides of a central aisle that was wide enough for a horse and handler to pass each other without difficulty. The floor was packed earth gone hard with use and cold. Overhead, the ceiling was heavy planked, well fitted, the boards thick and close together with almost no gap between them. To the left, about 2/3 of the way back, a ladder ran up to a loft that extended the full length of the west wall, visible in the dim as a darker darkness above the line of the stall posts. The stalls in the 3rd and 4th positions on the east side were different. She stopped in front of the first of them. A mare bay going dark in the low light, standing with her weight settled back, and her head carried lower than it should have been. Not dramatically lower. Not the low of a horse in acute distress. The low of something that had been managing discomfort for long enough that managing had become the default position. The mare's eye was quiet in a way that was not the quietness of rest. It was the quietness of an animal that had learned to be still because stillness was cheaper. Then the coughing started. Low and repeated, a sound like something trying to clear a passage that would not clear, not violent enough to be alarming on its own. The kind of cough that would be easy to explain away one day and impossible to explain away 2 months later. Ruth stood in the aisle and breathed. She breathed deliberately, the way her father had taught her to assess a space, the way Dr. Eleanor Marsh in Dodge City had told her once that a room's smell was the first diagnostic tool any practitioner had available before they'd laid hands on a single patient. She was not a practitioner in any official capacity. She had never claimed to be, but she had spent 2 years in that clinic, reading everything Eleanor put in front of her, and watching everything Eleanor's hands did, and asking every question she could ask without becoming intolerable. And she had spent the preceding 27 years of her life helping her father with animals that could not tell you what hurt. The barn did not smell wrong. That was what was confusing about it. There was no obvious rot, no smell of illness the way there was in places where sickness had progressed past the point of containment. What was there was more subtle. A weight, a flatness, the specific quality of air that had been enclosed in the same space for a long time and had exhausted whatever it once had to offer. She walked to the far end of the barn and breathed again, flatter still. The air at the north end, near the big doors that Wade had told her opened north, was worse than the air at the south end. Not in any way that would make a person cough once and know something was wrong, but in the way of something cumulative, something that had been building since the first time those doors had been closed against the cold. She looked up, the ceiling close and tight, the boards showing no gaps, no knothole, no 1/4 inch of space where a draft could move. She looked at the walls on both sides, same construction, well built, the work of someone who had meant to make this barn last. In summer it would be fine. The big north doors thrown open would create a current the full length of the building, pulling fresh air in from outside and pushing the accumulation of breath and hay and waste out the other end. But November was not summer. November was the north doors sealed against the cold and 40 horses generating heat and moisture in a sealed box, and the air having no more movement than the air in a closed room. She climbed the loft ladder. The hay was stored in a long, low pile along the west wall of the loft, stacked from the floor of the loft up to within 3 feet of the slanted roofline. She moved along it slowly, one hand trailing on the pile to keep her balance in the dark, her feet finding the boards carefully. About 2/3 of the way back, directly above the stalls where the sick horses stood, she stopped, crouched, pressed her palm flat into the side of the hay, slightly warm. The ambient warmth of the space absorbed and held. She pressed harder, deeper, took her hand away and put her face close to the surface of the hay, close enough to feel the faint emanation of stored warmth against her nose and cheeks. Breathed in, slow. Let her lungs fill and then let them empty and then breathed in again. The hay smelled like hay. Dry, grassy, the specific sweetness of cut things preserved. Clean on first pass. But underneath, in the second and third pass, with her nose close to the surface and the smell concentrated, there was something else. Something faint enough to miss if you were not looking for it. A softness under the dry smell. A hint of dampness that had been sealed in, the way moisture seals into wood when you close a jar too soon. The way warmth turns to ferment when the conditions are exactly wrong. Hay baled wet. Not obviously wet. Just slightly. Just by a few % of moisture that should have dried out before the baling happened, but had not, and had been sitting in this loft since August, giving off that faint damp slowly into the warm closed air of the barn below, where the horses breathed it in with everything else they breathed, every hour, every day, for 3 months. She sat back on her heels and stayed there a moment. It was not one thing. That was the difficulty. Any single element was too small to be the cause on its own. The barn was well built. The hay was mostly sound. The construction was good. The ventilation would have been fine in every previous year, when the combination of elements had not been precisely this. But all of it together, the sealed ceiling and the closed north doors, and the warm bodies of the animals themselves pulling whatever trace moisture existed up out of the hay above them, and holding it in air that had nowhere to go, all of it together across 3 months was enough. Enough to stress the respiratory systems of animals that were otherwise healthy. Enough to make them vulnerable to what they might otherwise have shrugged off. Enough to kill them, eventually, one by one, in a way that looked like illness and was illness, just not the kind that Tate had been looking for. She was not certain. She had learned to be careful with certainty, the same way she had learned to be careful with promises. But she was close enough to want to see more. She came down the ladder and stood in the aisle for another moment, looking at the mare in the third stall. The mare looked back. The coughing had stopped for now. Then Ruth noticed the boots. She noticed them because she had not been looking at the floor near the base of the ladder, and her lantern light caught the impression in the dirt as she turned to go. A boot print, not hers, larger than hers, pressed into the dust where the dirt floor was softer near the base of the loft ladder. Fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. The size and depth of a grown man's boot, not Silas. She had watched Silas walk across the yard and his right foot landed clean and his left foot scuffed at the outside edge from the way his damaged knee shifted his gait. This print was clean on both sides. She looked at it for a moment without moving. Looked up toward the loft, looked back down at the print. She did not say anything about it. Not yet. She turned and walked back down the aisle toward the barn door and out into the cold night air, and she did not look back. The kitchen was empty when she came through it. The lamp had been turned down on the table, and the fire in the stove had gone to coals. She hung her coat on the peg and stood for a moment in the warmth of the room, thinking. The study was at the front of the house, off the main hall. A line of lamplight showed under the door. She knocked. "Come in." He was at the desk as she had expected him to be, but not doing anything with the papers in front of him. Just sitting. In the particular way of someone who has been tired for long enough, that sitting has started to feel like its own kind of labor. The tiredness not of that day's work, but of a longer accumulation that did not fully go away with sleep anymore. He looked up when she came in and waited. "I'd like to ask you some things about the barn." She stayed near the door, not out of uncertainty, because she wanted to be able to read his face, and the lamp on the desk was at the right angle for that from where she was standing. Tate's already been out twice. Not defensive, just informational, the way of a man who has already exhausted one avenue and is not sure there is a second. I know. I'd like to ask anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Then he gestured at the chair across the desk without ceremony. She sat. She asked him when the stalls in the back third of the east side had last been completely cleaned out and restocked with fresh bedding from a different source. He said the bedding was from the same load brought in August. She asked whether there were any ventilation openings in the ceiling of the barn. He said there were not. The barn had been built tight. She asked whether the north doors had been opened for any extended period in the past 6 weeks. He said not since the first hard cold, which had come earlier this year than usual, end of September. Then she said what she had spent the walk back from the barn deciding how to say. I think the air in the back stalls has gone bad. He looked at her without speaking. She described what she'd found in the loft, not with drama, just in sequence, the flatness of the air along the east side, the warmth of the hay when she pressed into it, the moisture she had detected, faint but consistent, in the section directly above where the sick animals stood. She described what she thought was happening, the sealed barn drawing the trace moisture up through the body heat of the animals and trapping it in air that could not move. She said she could not be certain without watching the results of a change, but she believed if they opened ventilation in the south wall, moved the hay from above the sick stalls to the far end of the loft, and relocated the affected animals to the front stalls where the gap under the north doors still allowed a thin movement of air along the floor, they would see a difference within 10 days. He listened. He did not interrupt her once, not to ask a question and not to object. When she was done, he sat quiet for a moment. Then Tate said it was a respiratory contagion, moving between animals. Then why haven't the horses in the first 2 stalls been affected? They've been in the same barn for 3 months. He did not have an answer for that. She could see it register. The particular quality of a man encountering a question he should have already asked himself. She kept her voice steady, the way she had learned to keep it from watching Eleanor. Not aggressive, not accommodating, just even. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before and I don't pretend otherwise. But I would like to try this before we lose another animal. He looked at the papers on the desk, looked at her. Silas won't want to move the hay. And something in her settled into the kind of clarity she rarely allowed herself. Because clarity in the wrong moment is just another way of being reckless. But this was not the wrong moment. I'll help him move it. She got up, adjusted her vest at the hip, the small habitual gesture she made when she was finished with something and moving to the next thing. She was at the door when his voice came again from behind her. You grew up with horses. Not a question. He had been assembling information from the conversation the way she had been assembling information from the barn. She stopped but didn't turn. My father kept draft horses in Indiana. He had opinions about everything to do with their care. She paused. He was right more often than not. She went out and pulled the door softly shut behind her and walked down the hall to the kitchen and through the kitchen to the room off the back of the house. She sat on the edge of the cot in her coat and did not light the lamp. Through the east window the stars were still out, very bright, very far away, in the way of things that give you no warmth but do not pretend to. She thought about the boot print in the dirt. She thought about 6 dead horses and 2 visits from a veterinarian who had said 2 different things. She thought about a barn built tight and a load of hay purchased in August and a man in a beaver felt hat who had tipped his hat on the Rollins platform with the specific courtesy of someone who wanted you to know he was watching. She did not know yet what connected these things. She did not know yet whether they connected at all. But she knew that the difference between a problem with a solution and a problem without one was usually not the problem itself, but the number of questions you were willing to ask about it before you decided you understood it. She had not asked enough questions yet. She unbuttoned her coat, hung it on the hook behind the door, sat back down on the cot, and in the way of someone who has learned to sleep when sleep is available, because it is not always available, she closed her eyes and let the day become tomorrow. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it, which was approximately the same thing for her purposes. In the morning the cold was harder. The kitchen was already warm when she got there, Silas standing at the stove with a cast-iron skillet and the particular efficiency of a man who has made the same breakfast in the same kitchen so many times that his hands know it without his mind needing to be involved. He looked at her when she came in, looked at the direction she was coming from. looked back at the skillet. He did not ask where she had been the night before, which told her he already knew. She poured coffee, dark and strong enough to hold its shape, into a tin cup from the pot at the back of the stove, and she sat at the table and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the window at the barn. Wade was already out there. She could see him at the corral fence in the early gray light, hat on, coat on, gloves on, watching the horses that were in the outside pen. Not doing anything, just watching. The way a man watches something he is afraid of losing and cannot stop thinking about. She finished her coffee, put the cup down, looked at Silas's back. "I'd like to talk to you about the hay before we start the morning." Silas turned the bacon without turning around. Figured. "Then let me tell you what I found." He didn't move from the stove, but she could see, in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his head, that he was listening. She told him everything she had told Wade, the same sequence, the same absence of drama, the same care to be accurate rather than persuasive. She had learned a long time ago that people who are worth persuading respond better to accuracy anyway. At the end she said she wanted to move the hay from above the east stalls to the far end of the loft this morning, cut ventilation openings in the south wall up near the roof line, and relocate the sick animals to the front stalls. Silas slid the bacon onto a plate and set it on the table. Turned, looked at her with the same expression he had given her the day before, the one that was not unfriendly and not welcoming, just honest. "Last person who gave me instructions about hay storage was Mr. Callister's father. 15 years ago. Was he right?" Silas considered this with what appeared to be genuine fairness. "Mostly." "Then let's start with the south wall." He took his hat from the peg, settled it on his head and walked past her toward the door, which was its own kind of answer. They worked through the morning. The loft was cold, colder than the barn floor, and the hay was heavy, each flake requiring you to commit your back to it in a way that accumulated quickly. Silas was more capable than his knee suggested he had any right to be. He had learned how to distribute weight and effort to compensate for the joint that would no longer do its share, and the result was a kind of practiced efficiency that looked slow and covered ground fast. He did not need to be told a thing twice. He did not offer opinions on what they were doing. He just did it. Ruth carried what she could carry. When a bale required 2 people, she was the second person. By midday, the loft above the east stalls was clear, the hay redistributed to the far end of the loft above the front stalls, and the sick horses had been walked one by one to the front of the barn and resettled in the first 2 stalls on each side, where the thin draft from the gap under the north doors moved steadily along the floor. She found the hand saw in the tool room off the back of the barn, a good one, the blade sound, the handle wrapped in leather that had dried and cracked but held. She measured 4 spots on the south wall, high up near the eaves, where the ventilation would pass above the animals but below the relocated hay, 6 inches each. She marked them with a stub of chalk she found on the shelf above the workbench. She cut the first one herself. It took longer than she would have liked. The planks were old-growth pine, dense and well-dried, the kind of wood that takes a saw seriously. But the blade was sharp, and she had learned from her father that the correct answer to a task being harder than expected is not to stop but to find the right rhythm for it. Silas watched her cut the first slot without comment. For the second, he appeared at her elbow and put his hands on the plank to hold it steady while she worked. He did the same for the third and fourth. When the last one was done, he stepped back and looked at the 4 narrow openings in the south wall, each one letting in a thin blade of cold November light. "That'll let the cold in," he said. "The cold is what we need." She set the saw down against the wall. Her arms were tired in the deep way of arms that have been used correctly. The air in here has been sitting in its own company for too long. It needs fresh, even if fresh is cold. Silas looked at her for a long moment. That's not what I'd expect from someone who just got off the train. She picked up her coat, which she'd laid over a sawhorse while she worked, and began putting it back on. It's what the horses need. He turned back to the wall and looked at the slots again. She could see, in the way his weight had settled, that something had shifted. Not agreement, exactly. Not yet. But the cessation of active doubt. The posture of a man who has stopped testing something and started seeing where it goes. That was enough for now. She had learned not to need more than that from people or from situations. Needing more than what was currently available was an excellent way to make yourself miserable, and she had been miserable before, and did not find it instructive anymore. The afternoon light was already failing by the time they finished. She walked back through the barn one more time before going in, stopping at each of the moved horses and checking the quality of the air at nose height, checking their weight and their breathing and the brightness of their eyes. She could not tell yet whether anything had changed. 3 hours was not enough time for anything to change, but she stood there anyway, because standing there was the only way she would notice when it did. Through the barn door she could see the yard and the house beyond it, the kitchen window lit from inside, Silas's shadow moving across the glass, and beyond the corral, just at the edge of the lantern's reach, the long dark of the Wyoming plain opening out toward the horizon that was already invisible in the failing light. She stayed until she could no longer see her own hand in front of her face. Then she went in. Word count: 4,121 weight, self-correcting and continuing. She had been in the clinic in Dodge City long enough to know that the hardest part of medicine, if you wanted to call what she did medicine, was not the doing of the thing. It was the waiting after the doing to find out whether the thing you did was the right thing. Eleanor Marsh, whose clinic it was, and whose competence had been the most instructive thing Ruth had encountered in 3 years of trying to figure out what to do with herself after Thomas, had said once that the waiting was diagnostic in its own way. What you felt while you waited told you something about whether you actually believed what you'd done. If you were calm, you had done the right thing, or something close enough to it that your nervous system had accepted it. If you were not calm, you either doubted the action or doubted yourself, and the difference between those two things mattered for what you did next. Ruth was not calm. She was not agitated either. She was in the particular state she recognized as operational, aware, cataloging, present to the specifics of the problem without being absorbed into them. The state she went into when she was working on something real. She ate supper with Silas and Wade that evening in the same silence as the night before, but with a different quality to it. The silence of the first night had been the silence of strangers. This was beginning to be the silence of people who had spent a day working together and did not feel the need to narrate that fact. Wade asked how the horses had taken to the new stalls. She said well enough that the mare with the persistent cough had settled and eaten a portion of her feed at midday, which was more than Silas had seen from her in 2 weeks. Wade received this information without comment, but she saw it land. After supper, he asked her to look at the books. The study had a desk, a lamp with a good chimney that threw clean light, a shelf of ledgers whose spines were labeled in different hands spanning about 12 years, and a sense of organized neglect, the accumulation of someone who had kept records because they mattered and had stopped adding context when the context became too difficult to write down accurately. She opened the oldest ledger first. She always started from the beginning. You could not understand where something was without understanding where it had been. The records from the first years were precise. Breeding schedules, purchase records, sale records, veterinary expenses, feed costs, the careful accounting of a man who had built something from a structure that required structure to survive. The handwriting in the early years was different from the handwriting in the later ones, the hand of a man who had been trying hard in the beginning and had relaxed into it once it became second nature. She recognized that transition in the way she recognized it in herself. The difference between the clinic records she kept in her first month in Dodge City, every entry written with the self-consciousness of someone being evaluated, and the records she kept a year in, when the act of recording had become part of the act of thinking. The records from 1,882 onward were thinner. Not in number of pages, but in the weight of the information on each page. Numbers without context. Expenditures without explanation. The record-keeping of a man who had started to find the distance between what the book said and what he was experiencing too large to bridge on paper. She found the hay supplier records in the third ledger on the right. Before 1,882, 3 different suppliers. The purchases distributed across the season, to get the best pricing and hedge against one source having a bad year. After 1,882, 1 supplier. She found the name and the rate and the terms, and she sat with those for a long moment. The rate had gone up in 1,883, up again in 1,884. The increases were not large on their own. Together across 2 years, they represented a 40% increase in feed costs against stable revenue from horse sales, which was not stable revenue at all, because the horses you might have sold were the horses that were dying. She set the ledger flat on the desk and pressed her hands to it. and looked at the ceiling. She was not certain yet, she was careful with certainty. But she was asking herself a question she had not been asking 2 hours ago, which was whether 6 dead horses and a hay contract that had become progressively more extensive and exclusive, and a veterinarian who had made 2 visits and said 2 different things, and a man in a beaver felt hat on the Rawlins platform were separate problems, or whether they were the kind of problem that looks like several things from the outside and is one thing from the inside. She did not say anything about this to anyone that night. She put the ledger back on the shelf in the order she had found it. She thanked Wade for the coffee that had appeared at her elbow at some point, and that she had drunk without noticing. She went to her room. She lay in the dark with her hands folded on her chest and the cold pressing at the east window, and thought about what she knew and what she did not know, and how much distance there still was between them. She thought about Thomas, about the way he had approached a diagnosis. Start with what you can observe, then with what the observation implies, then with the minimum number of assumptions needed to connect the two. He had been very good at it. He had died of a disease he caught from a patient he was treating for free, because the patient could not pay him, which had nothing to do with his diagnostic skill and everything to do with the kind of man he was. She had been angry about that for a long time, and had come out the other side of the anger, into something that was not exactly acceptance, but was quieter than anger, which had to be close enough. She had been trying for 3 years to figure out what a life looked like from the other side of that quietness. She had some ideas. She was not sure yet whether Rawlins was one of them or just another mile marker on the way to wherever the ideas led. What she knew, lying in the dark in a strange cot in a strange room with the Wyoming night pressing at the window, was that there were horses in a barn 30 feet from where she was lying that needed the thing she had done today to have been the right thing. She wanted it to have been the right thing for them. She was not yet thinking beyond that. She let herself sleep. 3 days passed. The sick horses were neither better nor worse, which was not nothing. They had not deteriorated. The one that had been most critically ill, the bay mare who had been off her feed for 3 weeks, drank at the water bucket consistently on the 2nd day, which she had not done the first. Silas noted this without comment and without being asked. He had a way of delivering information that felt like handing something over carefully rather than showing it off, and Ruth appreciated this more than she would have expected to when she arrived. Wade checked the horses each morning himself before breakfast, a circuit of the stalls that he had been doing before she arrived and continued doing, with no change in method or duration. She watched him from the loft ladder one morning, not meaning to watch, having come up to check the hay and then stopped when she saw him below. He moved through the stalls with the ease of someone who knew each animal individually, not just as a unit of livestock, but as a particular creature with particular habits. And his hands when he checked them were quiet and confident, the hands of someone the animals had learned to trust. He spent longer with the sick ones. He did not speak to them or coddle them. He just gave them the extra time and let that speak for itself. He was a man who communicated through what he did rather than what he said. And she was beginning to understand that this was not reserve or coldness, but something more like precision. He did not want to say anything he could not stand behind, and so he waited until he could stand behind it, and in the meantime he just kept working, which was a way of saying things that he found more reliable than words. She understood this more than she had expected to. Thomas had been a talker. She had loved him for it, had loved the way his mind operated out loud, had learned more from listening to him think than she had from most deliberate instruction. But after he died, she had found herself gravitating toward quiet people, people who made their meaning in other ways, because she had a whole conversation still going on in her head with Thomas that she had not finished yet, and it was easier to have that conversation without someone else's words getting in the way. She came down from the loft. Wade was at the far end of the aisle, checking the water level in the trough. She walked toward him without hurrying. "The bay in the 2nd stall on the left," she said. "She was at the water bucket when I looked in last night before bed, both times." He looked up. Silas said, "It's early, but it's not nothing." He nodded, not with enthusiasm, with the careful acknowledgement of a man who had been disappointed by early signs before, and was not going to let himself lean on them until they held weight. She respected that. "We'll know more in another week," she said. "I know." She started toward the barn door. His voice stopped her, not loud, just present. "The Haskell mare." He meant the breeding mare due in February, the one whose foal he was counting on. "She's in the fourth stall on the right. Keep an eye." She turned back just enough to show she had heard. "I will." She went out into the cold morning, across the frozen yard, back toward the house and the books that were waiting for her, and the long work of understanding what this place actually was before she could do anything useful with it. The fourth day, the bay mare ate her full ration for the first time in 3 weeks. Ruth saw it and did not say anything about it. She wrote it down in the small notebook she had been keeping. Her own notebook, separate from the official records. She had started it the second night, the way she started one everywhere she worked, a running account of what she observed and when and under what conditions. Not for anyone else. For herself, for the record, for the day when she might need to understand how she had arrived at a conclusion. By the 6th day, the coughing in the east end of the barn had dropped by half. Silas mentioned it over breakfast with the same tone he would have used to note that a fence post needed replacing. She said she had noticed. He said nothing else. Wade looked out the window at the barn. And on the morning of the 9th day, Silas came in from his before-breakfast round, hung his hat on the hook, sat down, and without preamble, said that the roan mare had been at the water trough at the right time this morning instead of standing off from it. He said it simply, without weight. The way a man reports a fact he has been watching for long enough that reporting it has become its own small ceremony. But underneath it, if you were listening for the thing underneath the thing, was the voice of someone who had been carrying a particular weight for a long time, and had just been told he could set it down. Ruth looked at Wade. Wade was looking at his coffee cup. His shoulders had a different quality than they had had the morning she arrived, a different quality than they had had the morning before. The quality of a man who has just been given back something he had started to believe was gone. She did not make anything of this aloud. She did not think it would help. "We should keep them in the front stalls through December," she said. Silas said he had figured. She poured herself more coffee and looked out the window at the barn in the gray morning light and thought about the long way still to go and the short way they had already come and the boot print in the dirt at the base of the loft ladder that she had not mentioned to either of them yet, and that had not gone away just because she had not mentioned it. She was going to have to mention it. Soon. Because there was a difference between waiting until you knew enough and waiting until the not knowing cost you something you could not get back. She had learned that lesson the hard way with Thomas, though in a different context and with a different kind of not knowing. But the lesson was the same. She had enough now to say something. She was not yet sure to whom or in what order. She would figure that out. She had figured out harder things. The morning light came through the kitchen window and caught the dust motes above the table and held them still for a moment before the warmth of the stove began to stir the air. And Ruth Calloway sat with her coffee in a kitchen in Wyoming that was not hers, and looked at the barn that was not hers, and thought about 6 dead horses and a bay mare eating for the first time in 3 weeks, and a man who had written a notice that said as long as it suited them both and meant it, and she thought that suited was possibly a word with more rooms in it than it appeared to have from the outside. She was not sure yet how many of those rooms she was prepared to enter. But she had opened the barn door on her first night without being asked, and she had climbed the loft ladder in the dark, and she had pressed her face against the hay and breathed in until she found the thing hiding underneath the clean smell. That was who she was. That was what she did. It was enough for now to know that. The morning Edgar Pruitt rode into the Coldridge yard, the sky had the specific quality of a Wyoming December sky that has decided to be gray as a matter of principle rather than weather. Ruth saw him from the study window. She recognized the horse first, a big liver chestnut with white stockings, the kind of horse a man buys to be seen on rather than to work from. Then the rider, beaver felt hat, dark wool coat with a collar turned up against the cold, sitting straight in the saddle the way men sit straight when they are performing arriving rather than simply arriving. She did not move from the window. She stayed where she was, ledger open, pen in hand, and watched him cross the yard toward the barn where Wade was working the morning feed. Pruitt dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to having his dismounting observed, tied the chestnut to the corral post, took his hat off and smoothed it and put it back on. Then he and Wade talked, and Ruth watched the talking without being able to hear it, which was its own kind of information. She read buddies the way other people read weather. Wade's posture was contained, weight distributed evenly, the posture of a man listening to something he has heard before in different words. Pruitt moved more. Hands, shoulders, the small gestural language of a man making his arguments with his whole body, because he has learned that the body persuades where words sometimes fail. They talked for perhaps 8 minutes. At the end, Pruitt looked toward the house, and Ruth stepped back from the window, not quickly, just enough to put the ledger's shadow between herself and the glass. She was not hiding. She was making a choice about when to be seen. Pruitt rode out the way he had ridden in, with the performance of departure, and Ruth set her pen down and went to find Silas. She found him at the tool bench in the barn's side room, repairing a section of harness with an awl and waxed thread, working in the economical way he did everything, each stitch placed precisely before moving to the next. She stood in the doorway and he did not look up, but his hands slowed in the way of a man preparing to speak. He came out after the 3rd mare died in October. Silas pulled the thread through. Then again after the 5th, offered to buy the ranch both times. Said it in different ways, but it was the same offer. Another stitch. Mr. Callister said no both times, and this morning? Same offer. Different framing. He looked up then for the first time, and his expression was not worried. It was the expression of a man who has been watching something for long enough to have an opinion about it, that he has been saving for the right occasion. He said he had a buyer in St. Louis interested in the land. Said if the operation continued to struggle, it would be better for everyone. If the sale happened before the bank got involved. Ruth leaned against the doorframe, the cold from outside pressed through the wall at her back. Did he mention the hay contract? Silas set the harness down. That was the tell, the setting down of the thing he was working on. Because Silas Monk did not set things down unless he needed both hands free to think. He mentioned that the feed costs had been particularly hard this year. Said it sympathetically. His mouth did something that was not a smile. He is very good at saying things sympathetically. She pushed off the doorframe and went back down the barn aisle, stopping at the Haskell mare's stall on the way out. The mare was standing well this morning, weight forward, the alert quality of an animal that has not decided to be unwell. Ruth put her hand on the mare's neck and felt the warmth of her and the steadiness of her breathing, and the small movement of her skin against the cold February. 10 weeks. If this foal came sound, if it was the right bloodline showing in the right way at the right time, it changed the arithmetic of the year in ways that no hay contract could override. If. There were a lot of ifs between now and February. Ruth had learned to be careful with ifs the same way she had learned to be careful with certainties, because they were the same animal from different directions. She went to the study. She had 3 ledgers open on the desk now, organized by year, and she had started a separate sheet where she was tracking the hay contract numbers against the horse mortality record and the veterinary expense log. She did not know yet what the pattern said. She knew there was one. Patterns did not announce themselves in her experience. They just made themselves impossible to ignore eventually, and she had learned to trust the eventually. Wade came in from the barn at mid-morning, leaving his coat on the peg in the hall. He stopped in the doorway of the study, not entering, reading the state of the desk and then the state of the person at the desk. He told you. Silas told me. Which I assume you expected. Wade looked at the ledgers. He had a way of looking at numbers that was different from the way he looked at horses or land or people. A slight closing off, the way a man looks at something he understands but does not like understanding. He comes every time there's a new loss, like clockwork, like someone who's been tracking the losses. She said it flat, the way she said things she was not yet ready to call conclusions. Just observations, placed where they could be looked at without anyone having to decide what they meant yet. Wade's silence had texture. She had learned in 10 days to read the different kinds of his silence, the way she read weather coming in over the ridge, the differences between the silence that meant he was thinking and the silence that meant he had already thought and didn't like where the thinking had gone. This was the second kind. Silas said something to me, Wade began, his voice dropping to the particular register he used when he was saying something that had been sitting in him for a while and was coming out slowly because he was still deciding how much of it to release at once. About a month ago. Before you came. He said he'd seen someone in the hay barn one night, late, when he'd gotten up because of his knee and gone out to check the horses. She put her pen down. He didn't tell me at the time because he wasn't sure what he'd seen. Dark late, his eyes aren't what they were at 30. He said the person left before he got close enough to be certain. Wade moved to the window, not looking out of it, just needing to not be in the center of the room for a moment. The horse tied at the fence at the far end of the yard was a liver chestnut with white stockings. Ruth did not say anything for a moment. Outside the window the yard was empty, the cold making everything still. He told you this morning, after Pruitt left. Why didn't Silas say something in October, before the fifth horse died? Wade looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was not accusation of Silas and not defense of him either. Just the look of a man who understood the particular kind of silence that comes from being unsure and not wanting to cause trouble on the basis of unsure. He wasn't certain. He's still not certain. But he's certain enough now. He's certain enough to say it out loud. He turned back to the window, which is its own kind of certain. She looked at the ledger open in front of her. The hay supplier's name was listed 9 times in the past 2.5 years. One supplier, one increasingly expensive contract. She thought about what it meant to have one source for a thing you could not do without, and she thought about who benefited from the simplification of that supply, and she thought about a veterinarian who had given 2 different diagnoses on 2 different visits, and both times had not landed on the one explanation that a woman with a farm childhood and 2 years in a clinic had identified in a single evening. She was not certain. She kept returning to that. She was not certain, and she would not say she was certain, and she would not let herself act as though she were certain, because the difference between a suspicion and a fact was the entire difference between doing something useful and doing something damaging, and she had spent enough of the past 3 years in proximity to damage to have strong feelings about adding to it without cause. But she was asking new questions, and the new questions were pointing in a direction. She went back to the ledgers. The knock at the study door came just before noon. Wade, still with his coat off, holding a piece of paper he had clearly been staring at for longer than it warranted. She looked up. Letter from Denver. He held it out. The buyer Pruitt mentioned, the one supposedly interested in the land. She took the letter. Read it. It was brief, the language of a business letter from someone who had decided against a transaction and was not inclined to explain the decision in detail. The gist: the party in question was no longer pursuing opportunities in Carbon County at this time. Signed by a law firm name she did not recognize. She handed it back. When was this written? 3 weeks ago. He folded it, tucked it into the inside pocket of his vest, the unconscious gesture of a man putting something away that he needs to keep track of. Pruitt was out here this morning talking about a buyer who had apparently already decided not to buy 3 weeks ago. The silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are in the same room with the same information, and neither has yet said the word that would make the information irreversible. Ruth said, "He may not know." The buyer withdrew. He may not. Wade's voice was even and careful, the voice of a man giving a possibility a fair chance, because being fair mattered to him even when it was inconvenient. Or he may know and came out anyway because he wanted to see how the land lay. She turned back to the ledgers, because there was nothing to say to that would help, and there was work in front of her that might help. And she had learned a long time ago the difference between the conversations that moved things forward and the conversations that just gave you somewhere to put your anxiety for an hour. She spent the afternoon with the books. By 3 o'clock she had found what she had been looking for, or close enough to what she had been looking for that it changed the shape of the problem. The hay contract signed in 1882 had a clause on the 3rd page, written in the language of a document drafted to be understood only partially on first reading. The clause stated that in the event of non-payment of any installment within 30 days of the due date, the full remaining balance became immediately payable, along with a penalty calculated at a rate specified elsewhere in the document. She found the rate specified elsewhere. She calculated the number it produced against the current outstanding balance. She sat with the number for a while. Then she went to find Wade. He was in the corral, working a young bay gelding on a long line, moving the animal in slow circles, watching its movement for the dozen small things that would tell him whether the horse was developing correctly. He saw her at the fence and brought the gelding to a halt and walked over without hurrying, which was how he did everything, the unhurriedness of a man who had decided long ago that moving faster than the task required was a kind of waste. She told him the number. He looked at her. She told him again. He put both hands on the top rail of the corral fence and looked at the gelding standing in the middle of the circle of churned earth, steam rising from its back in the cold air. The gelding looked back at him with the mild patience of a horse that has learned to wait. The penalty clause. Not a question. Third page. The language is designed to be missed on the first reading. She kept her voice level. The increases in the annual rate combined with the penalty structure mean that if payment falls 30 days behind, the balance owed becomes larger than the value of the operation's current liquid assets. Wade's hands tightened on the fence rail. Not dramatically, just the small whitening of knuckles that happens when a man is holding something steady because he needs to hold something steady. When's the next payment due? February 15th. He turned to look at her. Something moved through his expression that she could not fully name. Something with anger in it, and something with a longer-standing tiredness in it. The kind of tiredness that comes not from this particular piece of information, but from the accumulation of a pattern that has just clarified itself all the way to the end. The Haskell mare foals in early February. I know. If the foal is sound, if it's the bloodline showing right, I could use it as collateral against the February payment. Buy time to restructure. That is a very large if to stake a payment on it is. He released the fence rail. Rolled his shoulders once, the small physical reset of a man gathering himself for what comes next. But it's what I have. She looked at the gelding in the corral, still standing in its circle of breath steam, still waiting with its mild patience. Then we watched the Haskell mare very carefully. He said it without inflection, which was its own kind of emphasis. She did not answer that directly. She was not yet ready to examine what we meant in this context, not with everything else the afternoon had put on the table. I'll start a monitoring record for her tomorrow. She went back to the house. Supper that night was quieter than the nights before it, which were already quiet. She ate and thought about the penalty clause and the February date and the liver chestnut horse at the fence at the far end of the yard in the dark. And she decided that she would go into Rawlins in the morning because she needed to see the town with her own eyes, and because she needed supplies, and because she had a feeling, the kind of feeling she trusted more than she trusted most things, that understanding Rawlins was going to be relevant to what happened next. The morning was clear and very cold. Wade let her take the buckboard without discussion, which she chose to read as practicality rather than either trust or indifference, though it was possibly some mixture of all three. She wore her good wool coat, the one with the double-breasted front that buttoned all the way to the chin and had deep pockets for her gloves, her hat, her boots, her vest, the full construction of a woman who had decided how she wanted to appear to a town that was going to have opinions about her regardless. Rawlins in December had a kind of blunt energy to it, the energy of a place that had reduced itself to the people and activities that could withstand winter. The main street was frozen mud rutted from wagon wheels and thawed and frozen again until the ruts had hardened into permanent features of the landscape. There were half a dozen horses tied at posts along the street, breath rising in plumes. The general store had a sign in the window advertising new stock from the fall rail shipment. She went to the general store first. The interior was warm, close, and smelled of dried goods, tobacco, and the specific lanolin smell of wool goods stored in an enclosed space. Behind the counter, a woman in her late 50s with the posture of someone who has stood behind a counter long enough that standing is now her natural state. Gray hair pinned up tight, eyes that moved to Ruth the moment she came through the door and did not move away. The particular assessment of a woman who makes her living understanding what people need and what they are. Help you. The voice was not unfriendly. It was precisely as friendly as the situation appeared to warrant, not 1 degree warmer, which Ruth thought was probably an accurate reading of the situation. Thread brown, 3 spools if you have it. Carbolic if you carry it. Lamp oil. Ruth moved to the dry goods shelves, and flour 5 pounds. The woman, who Ruth later learned was Margaret Morrison, wife of the store owner and the actual operational force behind the counter, while he managed the books and the back room, watched her select items with the careful attention of someone filing information. "You're the woman out at Cold Ridge Ranch." "I am." "Doing the books," Silas said. Not quite a question, almost. Among other things, Ruth brought her selections to the counter. "Do you carry carbolic?" "Medical cabinet, back left." A pause while Ruth went to find it. Then, when Ruth returned, "What kind of other things?" Ruth set the carbolic on the counter with the other items. "The horses have been ill. I have some experience with animal care." Margaret Morrison wrote the items on a slip of paper in a neat hand. Must be a specific kind of experience to be useful to someone like Wade Callister. There it was, the shape of the question that had been under all the other questions. Ruth counted out coins from her purse and placed them on the counter one at a time, a habit she'd developed from years of watching clinics manage accounts. My father kept horses in Indiana, and I assisted a physician in Dodge City for 2 years before coming to Wyoming. A physician. The repetition of the word had a particular quality, not mockery, more like the sound of a category being revised. Men physicians. Dr. Eleanor Marsh. She has practiced in Dodge City for 11 years. Ruth said it without defensiveness, which was its own form of defense. She is very good. Margaret Morrison gave her the change without counting it back, which meant she had been counting it in her head while they talked. Cold Ridge has had a difficult run. She said it toward the counter rather than toward Ruth, the way people say things they mean but are not prepared to own quite yet. Wade Callister is a decent man. Had a very hard time after Dora died. I know. She did not say how she knew. She did not say that Wade had told her about Dora on the 9th night in the study briefly, the way he said everything briefly. Just the name and the year and the specific sentence. She died in childbirth, and I wasn't able to do anything about it, which he had said with the flatness of a man who had said it to himself so many times the surface of the statement had worn smooth. She did not say that the way he had said it had told her more about him than everything else he had said in 9 days combined. She picked up her parcel. Thank you for the help. Watch yourself on the road back. Margaret Morrison said it to the counter, or to the space where Ruth had been standing, or possibly to some version of the situation that she had been quietly revising for the past 5 minutes. The ice comes up fast on the north stretches. Ruth went out. The cold hit her face, and she walked toward the buckboard with her parcel under her arm and her breath making small clouds, and thought that Margaret Morrison was probably not a bad woman and would possibly come around to a more accurate read of things given enough time. Time was the one thing Ruth had learned you could not accelerate, no matter how clearly you saw where it was going. She was 2 shops down from the general store when Edgar Pruitt came out of the land office. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. His expression did not change, which was more telling than if it had. He adjusted the collar of his wool coat, dark green today, same beaver felt hat, and came toward her with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has decided to encounter her and is making it look like coincidence. Mrs. Calloway. The hat came off, went back on. Rollins doesn't see many new faces in December. A pleasure, Mr. Pruitt. She kept her parcel under her arm and her feet pointed at the buckboard. I was out at Cold Ridge this week, I imagine Wade mentioned. He fell into step beside her, not quite blocking her path, not quite not blocking it. The precision of a man who has practiced the geometry of conversation. He's a proud man. Doesn't always make the decisions that would most benefit his situation. Most men who build something worth keeping are proud of it. She stopped at the buckboard and set her parcel behind the seat. I find that's generally appropriate. Pruitt smiled. The smile of a man who has been told he is being handled and does not mind because being handled means the other person has decided to engage. The operation has suffered significant losses. It takes resources to recover from that kind of thing. Resources that aren't always available from within, or the losses stop. She climbed to the seat, and what looks like a crisis turns out to be a problem with a solution. He looked up at her from the street, the angle putting her above him for the first time in the conversation. And something shifted in his expression. Not the pleasantness that stayed. It was too practiced to go easily. But behind it, something recalculated. I hope that's true, he said, for Wade's sake. She picked up the reins. Good morning, Mr. Pruitt. She turned the buckboard and drove out of Rollins the way she had come in, and she did not look back. Because looking back was a choice, and she made her choices deliberately, and looking back at Edgar Pruitt was not a choice she was going to make. The road back was exactly as cold as the road in had been. She thought about the land office. She thought about what kind of business you did in a land office when you already owned the largest parcel of land in the county and had just told a woman that you hoped her employer's operation would recover. She thought about timing, the kind that looks like coincidence and is something else. She thought about Dora Callister. The way Wade had said the name in the study, quick and careful, like setting down a glass that was still fragile. And she thought, not for the first time, about the specific mathematics of grief, the way it does not operate on any schedule that the outside world respects, the way it can sit quietly for years, and then put its hands on you in a moment you did not prepare for. Thomas had been dead 3 years and 4 months. She knew this without calculating it, the way you know the temperature of a room you have lived in long enough. She was not done with the knowing. She was not sure she would be. But she had learned in the 3 years and 4 months that being not done with a thing and being available to new things were not mutually exclusive. They were just difficult to manage simultaneously. She was managing. She got back to Cold Ridge in early afternoon. Wade was at the fence of the near pasture, watching 2 of the younger horses run the fence line in the cold, the way young horses run fence lines, for the pleasure of running and the pleasure of the cold and no particular reason beyond those. He turned when he heard the buckboard. She pulled in and handed him the parcel from the back of the seat and told him what Pruitt had said on the street. Wade listened with his hat brimmed down against the wind, and when she was done he stood quiet for a moment in the way that meant the thinking had gone somewhere. He did not want to follow out loud yet. Then he said, "He was in the land office this morning. I saw nothing filed. I checked with Reed on the way back from Pruitt's visit last week." Judge Reed, she had gathered, was both the county judge and the county's institutional memory, a man who knew what was in every document filed in Carbon County for the past 12 years and could tell you without looking. But the fact that he was there means he's preparing something, or he wants someone to see him preparing something. She picked up her parcel. One is more dangerous than the other, and I can't tell yet which it is. He took the parcel from her without asking. She let him. They walked back toward the house in the cold, and she noticed, not for the first time, that he matched her pace without appearing to think about it, the adjustment of a man who has learned to be present with the person he is moving with rather than just moving. She went back to the study. Silas came in at 3 with coffee, which he set on the corner of the desk and left without commentary, which was its own form of eloquence. She was working through the 1883 ledger when she heard Wade in the hallway, stopping outside the study door rather than passing it. She waited. After a moment he knocked, which was new. He had not knocked before. "Come in." He came in with his hat in his hands, which was also new, and stood in the center of the room in a way that made the room feel smaller than it had all afternoon. He looked at the ledgers and then at her and then at the window, which was showing the last of the daylight on the near pasture. "Dora," he said at first, before anything else, the name by itself, taking up space on its own term. "She died in the spring of '79, March. The child also." He stopped, started again from a different place. Tate was the physician in attendance. He was the only one available. Ruth put her pen down carefully. "He did what he could, I believe that. I believe it now." Wade's voice was even, the evenness that takes work. "But I have wondered, at intervals, whether what he could do was the full extent of what could have been done. And I never had a way to answer that question." He looked at her then, directly, the kind of direct look he used when he was not going to soften something. "Until you told me about the hay. And I thought about Tate and what he said about the horses. And I thought the 2 things are not the same, but they are not entirely different either," she said, because it was true and he needed to hear something true. A physician at a difficult birth in 1879, in a Wyoming town, had a fraction of the tools and knowledge that were available even 2 years later in a clinic in a city. The limitations were not his limitations. They were the limitations of what medicine knew how to do. "I know that." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I have known that for 5 years. It helps less than it should." "Yes." She let that sit where it was. "It does." He put the hat back on, a gesture that meant he was going back to the part of himself that handled things rather than the part that felt them. She watched him do it without comment because the watching was enough. "The Haskell mare. You said you'd start monitoring tomorrow." "I will. I'll have Silas set a cot in the front tack room for January. So there's somewhere to rest if you're watching through the night." She thought about the word if. The cot was not being set up for if. They both knew it was not for if. That would be practical. He went to the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame, not turning. "Thomas. That was your husband's name." She did not ask how he knew. Silas probably. Or the notice itself. She could not remember what she had put in the reply. Yes. Was he a good man? She thought about Thomas in the careful way she thought about him now, not the raw first-year way, not the defended third-year way, but the way she was working toward, the way of someone who is learning to hold a thing with both the love and the loss at once without either one crushing the other. He was a very good man, she said. He died of it, a little. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then I understand that. And he went out. She sat in the study after he left, in the lamplight with the ledgers around her, and she thought about two people who had each lost the person they had organized their life around, and had each spent years learning to organize around the absence, and were now, in the specific circumstances of a Wyoming winter, and a dying herd, and a hay contract designed to fail, learning what it felt like to organize around something present again. She was not going to rush anything. She was not made for rushing, neither was he. Some things required the same patience as a diagnosis. You gathered the information, you watched the changes, you waited for the picture to clarify, and you did not name what you were seeing until you were sure enough to say the name out loud. She was not sure enough yet, but she was closer than she had been this morning. She turned back to the ledgers, and worked until the lamp needed refilling, and then she refilled it, and worked a while longer, because the books would not read themselves, and the hay contract would not explain itself, and the February date was not moving regardless of how she felt about it. The Haskell mare was restless in her stall when Ruth checked the barn at 9. She settled after a few minutes of company, which told Ruth something about the mare's temperament, that she was the kind of animal that wanted a witness more than she wanted intervention. Ruth could work with that. She understood it more than she would have said aloud. She stood in the aisle with her hand on the mare's neck and listened to the barn settle into its nighttime sounds. The shift of hooves on straw, the slow breathing of sleeping animals, the small wind coming through the ventilation slots in the south wall, the slots she had cut herself with Silas's hand on the board to steady it, moving through the barn at nose level and carrying with it the clean, cold smell of December prairie. The air was better. It had been better for 10 days, and it continued to be better. The way things that have been fixed in the right place continue to hold. She breathed it in and thought about boot prints in the dirt, and a liver chestnut horse, and a man in a land office, and a penalty clause on the 3rd page of a document designed to be misread. She thought, I have not yet asked all the questions, she thought, but I know which ones are left. She went back to the house, to her room with its east window and its braided rug and the hook on the back of the door where her second dress hung. She sat on the edge of the cot and unlaced her boots with the particular care of someone whose boots are the only pair she has, and who treats them accordingly. Outside the window the stars were out again, the same stars as the first night, in the same cold sky, offering the same ration of light and no warmth. But the room felt different than it had on the first night, not warmer in any temperature sense, just less like a place she was passing through. She lay back and looked at the ceiling and thought about the Haskell mare and the February date and the cot that was going to be set up in the tack room in January. And she let herself, just for a moment, think about what it meant that someone had thought to offer it without being asked. She let herself think about it. Then she let it go. Because the thinking was enough for now, and she had learned that the distance between enough and more was the exact distance that separated a woman who was managing from a woman who was not. And she was managing. She was managing just fine. The ledger for 1,882 had a water stain on the lower right corner of the 3rd page, a brown ring the size of a silver dollar, the kind left by a coffee cup set down carelessly on an important document by someone who had not yet understood it was important. Ruth had been looking at that stain for 3 days. Not at the stain itself, at what was under it. The penalty clause sat beneath that ring like something that had been hidden in plain sight, which was the most effective kind of hiding because it required no conspiracy, only the ordinary human tendency to read what you expected to find and stop before you reached the part that would change everything. She had read past it on the first pass. She had caught it on the 3rd. She was honest with herself about that. January came in hard. The temperature dropped below 0 on the 2nd night and stayed there for a week. The kind of cold that made the barn walls contract at night and expand again in the morning with small sounds like a house settling. Except the barn was not settling, it was just surviving, which was approximately what everyone on the property was doing. The cot Silas had moved into the front tack room was a narrow thing with a canvas cover over a corn husk mattress, and Ruth had made it acceptable with the extra blanket from her room and the sheepskin she had found folded on the shelf above the tack hooks. She did not sleep there every night. She slept there when the Haskell mare needed watching, which was becoming more frequent as January deepened, and on the nights she did not sleep there, she woke once or twice anyway, and lay in her room listening for sounds from the barn that she could not have heard through 2 walls and 30 feet of frozen yard, even if there had been sounds to hear. The mare was doing well. That was the honest assessment, neither optimistic nor cautious, just accurate. She was eating well, moving well, carrying the foal high and forward the way a mare in good condition carries. Ruth checked her every morning before breakfast and every evening after supper, running her hands along the mare's sides and checking the temperature at her flanks and watching the quality of her movement when she shifted in the stall. She kept the monitoring record in the small notebook, 1 entry per visit, the date and the time and the observations in the precise shorthand she had developed at the clinic. Not for anyone else, for herself and for the record, and for the thing she was beginning to acknowledge she was building, a documented case. Because the boot print had not gone away. It had been covered by new straw and new foot traffic and the natural processes of a working barn, but it had not gone away in the sense that mattered, which was in the record of what she had seen and when. She had written it down the morning after she found it. Date, description, location relative to the loft ladder, estimated size. The condition of the surrounding ground that told her it was recent. She had written it in the small notebook, along with the horse observations, which meant it was in there with everything else she knew, cross-referenced by date against the timeline of the dead horses and the veterinary visits and the hay supplier payments. She was building something. She had not yet said out loud what she was building toward, but she knew. Wade found her in the study on the 7th of January. Which was the day the second letter arrived. She heard him come in from outside, the particular sound of his boots on the porch, and then the hall that she had learned to identify without looking, the specific weight and cadence of a man who covered ground efficiently and did not announce himself with noise. He came to the study doorway with his coat still on and a letter in his hand, and his face had the quality she had come to recognize as his anger, which did not look like most people's anger. It looked like additional stillness. A slight compression, like something being held in rather than expressed, and the eyes a degree more focused than usual, sharpened by something that was not quite cold and not quite hot. He held out the letter. It was from the law firm in Denver. Not the same letter as before, not the brief withdrawal of interest. This was longer, more formal, the language of a document that had been constructed carefully by someone who understood exactly what they were constructing. The gist, translated from the legal architecture designed to obscure the gist. The hay supply contract of 1,882 had been assigned to a holding company registered in Denver, which was a lawful transfer per the terms of the contract's assignment clause, which Ruth immediately went to find in the original document, and found on the 4th page in language she had read, and noted, and not fully understood the significance of until this moment. The holding company was now the party to whom payment was owed. The holding company was requesting payment of the current outstanding balance, plus the accumulated penalty, per the terms of the penalty clause, the total of which the letter specified. The number was larger than she had calculated, because the penalty had been running, apparently, since a payment in August that had arrived 4 days late, which had triggered the clause, which had been accumulating since then, which meant that the contract had been in default for 5 months, without anyone on this side of it knowing. She sat with the letter for a moment. August, she said. 4th. Wade had not moved from the doorway. I sent the payment on the 1st. It should have reached the supplier by the 3rd. But the letter says the 4th. The letter says the 4th. She looked at the delivery record she had found 2 weeks ago and pulled from the back of the 1,882 ledger, where it had been filed with the original contract. The payment record in Wade's hand showed the draft sent on August 1st. The supplier's receipt, which she had, showed receipt on August 3rd. The letter from Denver claimed arrival on the 4th, 1 day. The entire structure of the penalty clause, the 5 months of accumulating default, the total that was now substantially larger than any restructuring she had been able to identify, rested on 1 day's discrepancy between the receipt that Wade had and the date the new holding company was claiming. She stood up. Where is the original receipt? He went to get it. She stood at the desk and looked at the letter from Denver and thought about the holding company and when it had been registered and who had registered it and whether anyone in Carbon County would know those things or could find out, And she thought about a man in a beaver felt hat in the Rawlins land office in December. And she thought about the specific timing of an August payment that arrived either on the 3rd or the 4th, depending on which document you were reading and what you needed the date to say. Wade came back with the receipt. She put it beside the letter. The dates were different one day. The kind of discrepancy that could be an error and could be something else entirely. "Judge Reed," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing, not yet." She held up a hand, not to stop him but to slow him, because going to Reed too early with too little was worse than waiting. "We need more than a date discrepancy. We need to know when the holding company was registered and by whom, and we need the postal record for the August payment, and we need to know whether the assignment clause in the contract was valid under Wyoming territorial law." She paused. "Do you know a lawyer? Henry Moss in Cheyenne. I used him for the land deed transfer when my father died. Can you trust him?" Wade considered this with the particular seriousness he brought to questions about people. He did not offer assessments of people quickly. She had noticed this and thought well of it. He's honest. He was honest when the land transfer was complicated, and being honest cost him more work than the alternative would have. "Write to him today." She was already moving to the desk for paper. "I'll tell you what to ask." They spent an hour on the letter. She dictated, he wrote, because his handwriting was cleaner, and a letter that looked clean was a letter that got read with more care, a small thing but the kind of small thing that accumulated into outcomes. When it was done, she read it through twice and changed 2 phrases, and he copied the changes in without commentary and then sealed it. And they had Silas take it to the Rawlins post office before noon, because the mail went out at 2, and there was no reason to wait another day. After Silas left, the house was quiet, in the particular way it was quiet when both of them were in it, and both thinking separately about the same problem. Wade made coffee, which he did when he needed to do something with his hands that was not the thing he was actually thinking about. She went back to the ledgers, not because there was new information to find, but because looking at the structure of what she already knew helped her think about what was missing. She found it in the feed expense column for October 1882. A payment to the same supplier, same amount as the August payment, with a note in Wade's father's handwriting that she had not noticed before because she had been looking at the numbers and not the notes. The note said, "Delivered 3rd, confirmed," underlined, which suggested that delivery confirmation had been a point of dispute before. She sat very still, not for herself, for the shape of what this implied. If this had happened before, if a delivery date had been disputed before, and Wade's father had noted the confirmed date specifically because it had been challenged, then the August discrepancy was not a clerical error and not a coincidence. It was a method, one that had been used before, and had been documented by someone who understood its significance and had written it down and then died before passing the documentation on. She took the ledger to Wade in the kitchen. He read the note. "Read it again." Set the ledger flat on the kitchen table and put both hands on either side of it and looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his face had the stillness of controlled anger, but beneath it something that was more complicated, something she recognized because she had felt it herself in different circumstances. The particular quality of grief that comes from understanding that the person you lost knew something important, and you did not get to ask them about it before they went. He knew. His voice was even. Quiet. He knew there was a problem with the dating, and he documented it, and he never told me. He may have thought he had more time. She said it carefully, because it was true and because it was the kind of true that needed to be said gently rather than accurately. Or he documented it and meant to tell you, and the occasion didn't present itself. People do not generally plan for when they stop being available. Wade looked at her for a moment with something that was not gratitude exactly but was adjacent to it. The look of a man who has been given a way to think about something difficult that costs him less than the way he was thinking about it before. Then he looked back at the ledger. It changes what we bring to Reed. It changes it substantially. She took the ledger back and set it with the others she had marked with strips of paper torn from the margin of the scratch sheet she used for calculations. If I'm right about the assignment being the same method, Moss will know whether it's legal under territorial law, and Reed will know whether the date documentation is sufficient to contest the default claim. And if Moss says the assignment is valid. She met his eyes, not looking away from the question because it was an uncomfortable one, because looking away from uncomfortable questions was exactly how a problem like this one got built in the first place. Then we can test the date, and we are doing so with your father's documentation and the postal record if we can obtain it, and the argument that the clause was triggered by a date manufactured to trigger it. She paused. That is not a weak position. It's not a certain one. No. She picked up the marked ledger. Certainty is not currently available. But certainty has not been available since September and the operation is still running, which says something about what can be accomplished without it. He did not answer that, but she saw it land. She was developing a sense for the way things landed with him, the small evidence of it in the set of his jaw, or the way his weight shifted almost imperceptibly, the physical register of a man who processed things internally and showed the results later in what he chose to do next. She went back to the study and kept working. The letter from Henry Moss arrived 10 days later, which was fast for a January letter from Cheyenne, which meant Moss had either been waiting for something to require to restore his attention or he had read the letter and understood that the situation did not benefit from a leisurely reply. She read it at the desk and then brought it to Wade at the barn, because the barn was where he was, and the information was not the kind that should wait for him to come in. He was at the water trough filling it from the barrel they kept inside, for days when the trough froze before noon. He looked at her face when she came through the barn door, and turned off the spigot without finishing. She handed him the letter. Moss had done what she had asked. The holding company had been registered in Denver in October 1884, the month after the sixth horse died. The same month Pruitt had made his second offer to buy Cold Ridge Ranch. The registered agent of the holding company was a Denver law firm with no obvious connection to anyone in Carbon County, which was not itself suspicious except for the timing, which was extremely suspicious. The assignment of the hay contract from the original supplier to the holding company had occurred in November, the same week Ruth had arrived in Rawlins, which she had not known, and which put a particular kind of light on the sequence of events since her arrival. The assignment clause in the original contract was technically valid under territorial law, Moss wrote, but the manner of its execution had several procedural irregularities that he identified specifically in a list she found she needed to read twice to follow. And the postal records. Moss had a contact at the Cheyenne Postal Office who had been able to access the Carbon County routing records for the August delivery. The package had been logged as received at the Rawlins Post Office on August 2nd. The delivery to the supplier's address had been logged August 3rd, not the 4th. The 3rd. Wade read it through to the end without speaking. Then he read it again. She watched him the way she watched the horses when she needed to know the truth of how they were doing, without announcing that she was watching, just present and attentive, and ready to understand what she saw. The holding company. His voice was very measured. Registered in October, the month after he came out the third time, and the month before the contract was assigned. He's been planning this for at least a year. Not a question. Not surprise. Something quieter than either, the specific tone of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he had been resisting and has stopped resisting it. The hay, the dating of the payment, the holding company. All of it. I think so. She said it the same way she had said everything she was not yet ready to call certain, with precision rather than force. The hay causing the horses to die, and the horses dying reducing the operation's viability, and the contract creating a debt structure that would eventually force the sale. And when that was taking longer than expected because the horses were recovering, the holding company and the assignment accelerated the timeline. Wade folded the letter once and held it in both hands, looking at the folded rectangle of it. Why? She had thought about why. She had been thinking about it since December, since the land office, since she had gone back through the history of Cold Ridge's hay purchases before 1882, and found the years when it had been profitable and the specific nature of what it had produced. The bloodlines, she said. Cold Ridge's breeding stock is among the best in the territory, and Pruitt knows it because he has been trying to buy into it for years and the access has always been no. The land has value. But the horses are the specific value that cannot be replicated by buying another property. You have to acquire this one. He looked at her. So he decided to acquire it, systematically, patiently, in a way that left him on the right side of every legal instrument while the result was anything but. The barn was very quiet around them, the horses breathing and shifting in their stalls, the thin sound of the wind through the south wall slots, The creak of the water barrel as it settled. Nothing that had changed. Everything that had changed. Wade put the letter in his vest pocket, rolled his shoulders once, the same small physical reset she had seen before. The gathering of a man who is moving from the part where he understands the problem to the part where he decides what to do about it. Read. Yes, but we go with everything, not a piece of it. She had been thinking about the sequence of this for days. The postal record, your father's documentation from 1882, the Hay analysis, the holding company registration date, the assignment irregularities Moss identified. All of it at once, so there is no space for a single piece to be dismissed as insufficient. The Hay analysis, he looked at her. We don't have one. She had been waiting for this. Silas has a sample. The silence that followed was the silence of a man learning something he had not known. Specifically the kind where the not knowing was protective and the knowing changed what was required of him. He kept some. He kept some. He didn't know why. He just didn't throw it away. She had thought many times about the specific quality of Silas Monk's instincts, the kind of careful practical wisdom that does not explain itself because it does not need to. There's a veterinarian in Cheyenne named Briggs. I have his name from a reference Dr. Marsh gave me before I left Dodge City. Independent practice, no connection to Carbon County. If the sample is still good, I've looked at it. It's sealed in canvas and it's been cold. It's good. Wade was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was notable because she had catalogued most of his expressions by now without intending to. It was the expression of a man who is revising an assessment he has already revised twice, the look of someone arriving at a degree of certainty about another person that they had not fully anticipated reaching. He said, "How long have you been building this?" Not an accusation. Just the question of a man who needed to understand the timeline. Since the boot print, she said. The boot print she had never mentioned out loud until this moment. She watched him understand that she had seen it and kept it, and added it to everything else, and brought it along as one piece in a structure of pieces that now, together, made something that could bear weight. "I was going to tell you," she said, "when I had enough to tell." "I know," he said it immediately. Not forgiving because there was nothing to forgive. Just acknowledging, "You're careful." "I'm careful," she said. "I've been wrong before by being less careful. I don't intend to repeat the error." He nodded once. The decision nod, the one she had learned, meant he had finished weighing something and was moving forward. Write to Briggs. She wrote to Briggs that afternoon, the letter to Cheyenne outlining what she had, what she needed assessed, and the timeline they were working against. She used precise language, clinical where precision helped, practical where it did not. The language of someone who knows what they are asking for and knows the person they are asking is capable of providing it. She sent it with Silas the next morning. The following days had a particular quality to them, the quality of waiting that is also working, where the waiting and the working are not separable because the waiting is itself a kind of preparation. She kept the monitoring records on the Haskell mare. She continued through the ledgers, building the complete picture she would need to present to Reed, organizing the documentation in the sequence that would make the clearest argument. She made a separate clean copy of the timeline, dates and events in order, with the relevant document reference beside each entry, the kind of record that could be read quickly by a man who had a lot of other things to read. She was sitting with this clean copy on a Tuesday evening, in the third week of January, when she heard the sound. She was in the study. The house was quiet, Wade in his room, Silas in the bunkhouse. The sound was from outside, from the direction of the barn, and it was not the sound of horses moving in their stalls or the creak of the barn wall in the wind. It was different, lower, a single discrete sound, something contacting something solid, the kind of sound that does not repeat because it was not supposed to be heard. She was up and moving before she had decided to move, her coat on the peg in the hall, her boots already laced because she had not changed for bed yet. She did not stop to get a lamp because the lamp would announce her. She went out the back door into the cold dark. The yard was very still. The sky was clear and the stars were out, and there was enough light from them to see the shapes of things. The barn a dark rectangle against the lighter dark of the sky, the corral a geometric shadow to its east. Nothing moving. No hoarse sounds of distress. She stood at the back door and listened with the whole of her attention, the way she had learned to listen in the clinic at night when the patients who were going to have problems always had them quietly. Then she saw the light. Not a lamp. A small thing. The brief glow of something burning, low to the ground at the far side of the barn, near the hay storage shed that sat off the barn's south end. There and then not there. There again. She moved. Not running. Moving with purpose and with quiet because she did not know what she was moving toward. And making noise was not going to help her understand it any faster. She went around the east end of the barn, staying close to the wall, and she came around the south corner, and the hay shed was in front of her, and the light was not a lamp. The light was fire. Small still. A pile of loose hay at the base of the shed's outer wall, burning with the specific hungry efficiency of dry material in winter air, the flames spreading outward rather than up, the way fire moves when it has been set with some understanding of how fire moves. 5 feet across already. Reaching the base of the shed wall, she did not think. She moved to the water barrel they kept at the shed's east end, the one Silas filled twice a week against the possibility of exactly this kind of need, and it was 3/4 full because Silas had filled it yesterday, and she knew this because she had watched him do it through the study window while she was working. She pulled the top off, and she took the bucket from the hook beside it, and she worked. She worked until the fire was out, which took 4 buckets on the main burn, and 2 more on the edges where the grass had caught. And then she stood in the cold with her hands shaking not from cold, precisely, and looked at the blackened patch of earth, and the scorched base of the shed wall, and the ring of scorched grass that showed her the original shape of what had been set. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked around the yard. Nothing. Nobody. Not anymore. The horse in the corral nearest the shed was agitated, blowing hard, and she went to it and put her hand on its neck and let it settle before she did anything else. Because the horse had not done anything wrong and settling it was the right thing to do. And sometimes the right thing to do was also the thing you needed to do for yourself. She found the cloth on her way back to the barn. It was caught on the bottom of the fence post nearest where the fire had been, a piece of oilcloth the size of her palm, the kind used to protect saddle leather in wet weather, dark red. She picked it up, held it in her hand. She had seen oilcloth that color on the saddle of a liver chestnut horse in the Cold Ridge yard in December. She held the cloth and she stood in the yard in the cold dark with the stars above her and the smell of scorched hay in the air, and she thought, not a warning, not random, deliberate. Because the hay shed sat against the south wall of the barn, and if the shed had gone the barn wall would have gone, and if the barn wall had gone the barn would have gone. And in the barn was every horse on Cold Ridge Ranch and the Haskell mare 6 weeks from foaling with a foal. That was the entire calculation on which the February payment rested. She put the cloth in her coat pocket and went to wake Wade. She knocked on his door twice, and his voice came immediately, which told her he slept lightly in the way of people who have been responsible for things that could go wrong in the night for a long time. She heard him up and moving before she had finished explaining what she had found. And he came out with his boots on and his coat over a flannel shirt and his hat already seated on his head. He went to the shed. He looked at the burn and the scorched wall and the blackened grass, and he crouched at the edge of it and put his hand to the earth and held it there for a moment and stood. She held out the oilcloth. He took it, looked at it, did not say anything for a long moment, standing in the cold yard with the cloth in his hand, and the stars above the ridge and the Haskell mare visible through the barn door she had left open. A dark shape in her stall settled again, still carrying whatever she was carrying with the same steady indifference to human trouble that had always been among the things Ruth found most clarifying about horses. She waited. Because waiting was what this moment required, not speech, not analysis. Just the space for a man to stand in his own yard and look at the thing that had been done to it and feel whatever he needed to feel about that before they moved to the part where they decided what to do about it. When he spoke, his voice was at its most even, the kind of even that is not calm, but is the thing on the far side of what calm becomes when it has been tested long enough. He came himself, or sent someone he trusted. Either way, it's the same answer. He knows the analysis and the letter to Moss, or he suspects. And he's decided to accelerate. Yes. She pulled her coat tighter. The cold was thorough now, the kind that works its way past layers, which means he's worried we have something, which means we probably have enough. He looked at her. In the starlight, his expression was the one she had not fully learned to read yet, the one that appeared in moments that were simultaneously about the immediate problem, and about something larger than the immediate problem. The expression of a man who is seeing two things at once and sorting which one he can speak to. He settled on the immediate. Read, this week. Yes. She had been thinking about the sequence. With everything. I'll have the documentation organized by tomorrow. And Silas needs to say what he saw on the night of the hay barn visit in October. On the record, he'll say it. I know he will. She turned toward the house. We should also write to the newspaper in Cheyenne. He was quiet for one beat. Then, before or after read. Same time. So that if Pruitt tries to slow the process through any of the 3 county board members he controls, there's already a record in a paper that is not the Rawlins Weekly and does not depend on his goodwill. Another beat of silence. Shorter this time. You've been thinking about this. She stopped walking and turned back. He was still standing at the edge of the scorched ground, cloth in hand, coat open despite the cold, looking at her with the expression that had 2 layers. She let herself look at it directly this time, rather than registering it and filing it away. I've been thinking about everything, she said. That's what I do. He held her gaze for a moment. Just a moment. Then he looked back at the shed. The hay. Tomorrow I'll get the sample from Silas and we'll pack it properly for the trip to Cheyenne when Briggs is ready to receive it. I'll write to Briggs again in the morning to confirm the date. He nodded. She went in. She hung up her coat and unlaced her boots, and sat on the edge of the cot in the tack room, which was where she had ended up, instead of her bedroom because the tack room was closer to the Haskell mare and she needed to be closer to the Haskell mare. And she looked at the lantern light on the wall and let her hands stop shaking all the way. Then she reached for the notebook and wrote the entry for the evening. The sound, the fire, the timing, the oilcloth, its color and size and the fence post where she had found it. The sequence of everything she had done. The condition of the shed wall. She wrote it all down because written things existed outside of memory, and memory was not reliable under pressure, and she intended to have no weak points in what she brought to read, none. She did not sleep for the rest of that night. She lay on the cot and listened to the barn breathe around her, and thought about what had to happen next, and in what order, and what the risks were at each step, and what could go wrong, and what she would do if it did. The Haskell mare moved in her stall once, a low sound of shifting, and then went quiet. Still there, still carrying. 6 weeks. Ruth thought, everything we have built in 2 months is still standing, the horses are healthy. The documentation is real. The fire failed because the water barrel was full, because Silas filled it on schedule, because this is a place where people do what they say they will do. That was not nothing. In fact, that was precisely the thing that Pruitt had not accounted for when he had built his careful, patient structure, designed to benefit from failure. He had built it to take advantage of a man alone and an operation struggling in a sequence of losses that would eventually compound into collapse. He had not accounted for the specific change that had occurred in the first week of November, which was that the operation was no longer being run by a man alone. Ruth thought about this and thought it was the most useful thing she had thought all night, and she filed it away in the organized system of what she knew, and she let herself close her eyes, and she let the barn sounds settle around her like something familiar, because they were now. She was asleep before she finished deciding whether to be. The reply from Samuel Briggs arrived on a Thursday, which was the kind of day that announces itself as significant only in retrospect. Ruth was in the tack room when Silas brought it in from the post, setting it on the edge of the shelf beside the monitoring notebook without ceremony. The way he delivered all information, as though the importance of a thing was self-evident and did not require presentation. She finished the entry she was writing about the Haskell mare's morning condition before she opened it, because the mare's condition was time-sensitive in a way the letter was not, and she had learned not to let urgency in one register displace attention in another. Briggs wrote the way she imagined he worked, direct, sequenced, no wasted language. He had examined samples consistent with the description she had provided, and could confirm that hay baled at the moisture content, suggested by her field assessment would, under the conditions she outlined, produce ammonia concentrations sufficient to cause the respiratory deterioration pattern she described. He had seen this before in one other case, 8 years ago in Laramie. He was prepared to testify to that assessment before any competent legal authority. He named his fee, which was reasonable, and his availability, which was immediate, and he said he could be in Rawlins within 4 days of receiving her confirmation. She read the letter twice. Then she went to find Wade. He was in the workshop off the north end of the barn, repairing the wheel of the buckboard where the iron rim had worked loose from the wood. He was working with a hammer and a set of iron clamps, his coat off despite the cold flannel sleeves rolled to the elbow, the particular focus of a man whose hands know a task so well his mind can be somewhere else entirely while they complete it. He looked up when she came to the doorway. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. She watched his face do what it did when information arrived that changed the shape of a problem, the slight reorganization behind the eyes, the recalculation. He set the letter on the workbench beside the wheel clamp. 4 days, he said. Right today. She wrote the confirmation that afternoon, and Silas took it on horseback to the Rawlins post office rather than waiting for the morning, because 4 days from today put Briggs and Rawlins on the 28th of January, and the February 15th payment date was not moving, and every day of preparation they had before they stood in front of Reed was a day that mattered. She also wrote to Moss. She told him what Briggs had confirmed and asked him to advise on the specific procedural questions she had been developing from the contract documents, the ones about the validity of the assignment under the circumstances of the October registration, and whether the documented date discrepancy in the August payment was sufficient to void the default claim retroactively. She asked him to reply directly to Rawlins. Then she wrote to the Cheyenne newspaper. This letter she wrote 3 times before she was satisfied with it, not because she was uncertain about the facts, but because the letter had to accomplish something specific. It had to be informative without being accusatory, because accusatory without a court determination behind it was actionable, and the last thing she needed was to give Pruitt a legal instrument to deploy before they had deployed their own. She described the situation in terms of documented facts: the hay contract and its terms, the holding company and its registration date, the delivery date discrepancy in the postal record, the fire and its physical evidence. She did not name Pruitt. She described the connection between the documented events in language that any reader with a functioning mind would understand pointed in one direction without her pointing. She gave it to Wade to read. He read it standing at the study doorway, still with his coat off from the workshop, the cold from the hallway behind him not apparently bothering him. He read it carefully, which meant he read it twice, and when he was done, he looked at her with something that was neither approval nor surprise, something more considered than either. You left him room to deny it. I left the facts room to speak. She took the letter back. He'll know it's about him. His response will tell us something about what he intends to do next. And if his response is to move faster on the legal action, then we're already in front of Reed with everything we have, and the newspaper has already published the account of documented facts. And moving faster on a legal action that is itself based on a fraudulent date is not a strategy, it's panic. She folded the letter. I want him to panic. Wade looked at her for a long moment with the 2-layer expression, the one she had almost fully decoded by now. The front layer was assessment. The back layer was something she was still being careful about naming. The arson, he said. You want to report it to the county sheriff? Yes. Before we go to Reed, because Reed's hearing will be civil, and the arson is criminal. And having it on the criminal record means Pruitt is managing 2 fronts simultaneously. People who are managing 2 fronts make different decisions than people who are managing one. She paused. Also, it is the right thing to do. Also that. A breath that was almost a sound of amusement, almost. Not quite. The sheriff is Hayes. He is not in Pruitt's pocket, but he is not looking for reasons to challenge him either. I know. I don't need Hayes to challenge Pruitt. I need Hayes to open a record. The record does the work. She sent the newspaper letter with the Evening Post. She sent the sheriff's report, written in the same factual language, with a physical description of the oilcloth and its location, and her assessment of the fire's point of origin, and its projected path, if it had not been stopped, the following morning. Briggs arrived on the 28th, which was a Tuesday, on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne. He was a compact man in his late 50s, with a gray beard trimmed close, and the particular kind of self-containment that comes from years of being called to situations that required him to be the calmest person in the room. He wore a dark wool coat and carried a large leather case that held his instruments and his documentation and the written assessment he had prepared based on the sample analysis. He came out to Cold Ridge that evening with Wade and Ruth, and he walked the barn from end to end with a lantern and his nose and his hands, the way she had walked it in November, and he stopped in the same places and breathed in the same way, and looked up at the same ceiling with the same kind of attention. She watched him without speaking. When he came to the south wall and found the ventilation slots she had cut, he stopped and looked at them for a long time. Correct placement, he said to no one in particular. Correct size. This solved the immediate problem. It did. Ruth kept her voice neutral. She was not looking for validation. But she was aware of the particular quality of hearing a trained professional confirm an assessment you had reached without formal training, the specific form of relief that does not quite feel like relief because you had known you were right and the knowing had been enough, but the confirmation settled something that the knowing alone had left slightly unsettled. Briggs examined the Haskell mare with the thoroughness of someone who was not going to cut corners because the circumstances suggested urgency. He checked her temperature, her respiration, the foal's position as best he could determine it by external examination, her weight, her feed consumption from the record Ruth had kept. He asked precise questions and received precise answers, and wrote notes in a small book that he carried in the inside pocket of his coat. She'll foal in 2 to 3 weeks, he said. She's in good condition. Whatever the barn situation was in the fall, it didn't reach her. She was in the front stalls, Ruth said. The draft from the north doors gave her marginally better air. I believe that's why she was spared. Briggs looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Not surprised, exactly, but revising. You identified the cause in November. I identified it in the first evening. I implemented the correction the following morning. He looked at the ventilation slots again. Looked at his notebook. The 4 animals that died after September. Were they all in the east stalls? Back section. The 4 that died of the respiratory condition. The 5th and 6th were in different stalls but had been moved there from the east section after showing symptoms. They were already compromised. He wrote something. Flipped back a page. Wrote something else, Mrs. Calloway. I'll need your monitoring records as part of my documentation. I have clean copies prepared. She had made them the day his reply arrived. 3 copies, each one identical, dated and signed. She had learned from watching Eleanor Marsh that documentation without copies was not documentation in any meaningful legal sense. He took the copies she brought from the tack room and read through them at the workbench, with the lantern slowly, the way he had read everything she had seen him read. When he was done, he set them flat on the workbench and put his hands on either side of them, the same gesture Wade had made with the letter from Denver, the gesture of someone pressing something into reality. This is the clearest sequential record of environmental cause and effect I have seen in a decade of practice. He said it to the records rather than to her. You did not overclaim, you did not overinterpret. You recorded what you observed, identified what changed, and documented the response. That is exactly what a court needs. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish the moment by adding to it. They sat up late at the kitchen table that night, all 4 of them, Ruth and Wade and Briggs and Silas, with the lamp turned up and the stove burning warm and coffee going cold in cups that kept getting refilled. They went through the documentation in sequence. Briggs's assessment of the hay sample and the ammonia accumulation. Ruth's monitoring records. Silas's account of the night visitor in October, which Silas gave in the same plain unembellished way he gave everything. The facts in order without editorial. The kind of testimony that is credible precisely because it makes no effort to be. The postal records from Moss. The 1882 ledger entry in Wade's father's hand. The holding company registration date. The assignment irregularities Moss had identified. The oilcloth. They arranged these things in an order that told the story from its beginning. Not from November, when Ruth arrived. From 1882, when the contract was signed. Because a story understood from its beginning is harder to dismantle than a story that starts in the middle, and she intended to give Reed a story that could not be dismantled. Briggs said he would appear before Reed as a professional witness on behalf of Cold Ridge Ranch. He said this without being asked, as though the offer was self-evident. She thought it probably was, to a man who had spent decades watching well-constructed truth go unheard because no one had arranged it correctly. Silas said he would say on record what he had said in that kitchen. He said it the same way he said everything, flat and final, the statement of a man who has decided and does not need to discuss the decision further. Wade said he would go to Reed in the morning to request a hearing before the 15th. Ruth said she would be ready. There was a small silence after that, the comfortable kind. The kind that happens between people who have been in the same difficulty together long enough that they have stopped needing to fill the air to prove they are still in it together. Briggs drank his coffee. Silas looked at the lamp. Wade looked at the table, and then at his hands, and then at the place where the table met the wall, the way he looked at things when he was thinking rather than seeing. Ruth looked at the window. Outside, the yard, the barn, the pasture, the long dark of the Wyoming plain, extending past the reach of any lamplight toward a horizon that was invisible in the January night. The same view she had looked at in November from the buckboard seat on the way in, the horizon that had looked like a proposition rather than a boundary. She had not resolved that yet, whether it was the one or the other, whether the difference mattered. She thought it might not matter as much as she had assumed. Briggs went to the Rawlins Hotel. Silas went to the bunkhouse. And the house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when the working part of the day was done, and there was nothing left to do but acknowledge that the day had happened. She was washing the cups at the basin in the kitchen when Wade came in from checking the barn. The last round of the night, the one he did every night regardless of what else the day had contained. He hung his coat, stood at the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand. She kept washing the cups because the cups needed washing, and standing still was not a thing she defaulted to. Ruth. He said her name the way he said the things he had decided to say, without preamble and without the hedging language of a man who was unsure whether to say them. The decision already made, the saying just the visible part of it. She turned, set the cup down on the sideboard. He was looking at her with the expression she had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks, the one with the 2 layers, and both layers were visible now, the front one and the back one, without the front one doing its usual work of keeping the back one from being seen. She thought it must have cost him something to let them both show at once. She thought he had probably decided it was worth the cost. "I'm not good at saying things," he began, his voice finding the register it found when he was being most accurate rather than most careful. "I am aware of that. I have been aware of it since November when you sat across from me in that study and described what was killing my horses in language so precise. I had no argument against any of it, and I understood that you were a person who said what you meant and meant what you said, and did not fill space with words that didn't earn their place." He stopped. "Let that settle. So I am going to try to say this in a way that earns its place." She waited, because waiting was what this required, and she was good at waiting when the thing being waited for was worth it. "I have not wanted anyone in this house since Dora died. Not confession, not apology. Just the fact of it stated plainly. Not because I was not capable of it, because I had decided it cost more than it returned and I was tired of costs I hadn't planned for." He turned the hat once in his hands, "And then you came off that train in November and carried your own trunk and walked into my barn without being invited and climbed my loft ladder in the dark and told me my horses were dying from bad air in terms I could not dispute. And within 3 days Silas was following your instructions about hay storage without being asked twice, which has not happened in 15 years of my knowing him." Something moved through her that she did not try to stop, a warmth that was not the stove's warmth, the specific internal shift of someone who has been seen accurately by another person, after a long period of being seen approximately. "I am not going to pretend," he continued, still careful, still earning each word, "that I understand yet what this looks like past the immediate circumstances. Past February. Past Reed and Pruitt and the Haskell foal and all of it. I'm not built for hypotheticals that far out. But I know what the last 3 months have felt like inside this house, and I know what the last 3 months felt like before you came, and they are different in a way I cannot attribute to anything other than you specifically." The kitchen was very quiet, the stove settling, the wind outside finding the eaves. She said, "Because she was also a person who said what she meant. When Thomas died, I decided very carefully what I was and was not going to expect from a day. I was very thorough about it. I made it a kind of discipline." She picked the cup back up, then set it down again, a small indecision that was unlike her and that she noticed. "I am not sure anymore that being thorough about not expecting things is the same as being wise about it." He looked at her. Just looked, the hat still in his hands, the lamplight making the kitchen smaller and warmer than it actually was. "What does that mean for you?" She thought about it. Not long. She had been thinking about it for weeks without acknowledging that she was thinking about it, and the thinking had produced something she could say. "It means I'm not leaving after February. Whatever happens with Reed. Whatever the result. She said it without qualification, because the qualification would have been a kind of dishonesty, and she did not want to be dishonest with him about this particular thing. I said the arrangement suited me, and it does, and that is true in more ways than it was when I said it in November. He held her gaze for a long time. The length of time of a man making sure he has understood correctly and does not want to proceed on an inaccurate reading. Then he nodded, the decision nod, the one she had learned. "All right," he said quietly, with the quality of a man for whom those two words were carrying considerably more than their surface weight. She turned back to the basin. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then she heard him move, not away from the kitchen, to the stove, where he picked up the coffee pot and judged what was in it by weight and set it back down. And he stayed there rather than going to his room, and she stayed at the basin, and the kitchen held them both in the lamplight for a while longer, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. She went to bed late and lay in the dark thinking about February, about the Haskell Foale and Reed and Briggs's testimony, and the documentation she had organized into a sequence that could not be dismantled. And then, because she had apparently decided she was going to let herself, she thought about the other thing, the thing past February, and she let herself think about it without the discipline of not thinking about it, and it felt like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for a long time. Not a draft, not a disruption, just air. The foal came on a Thursday in early February, which was the 3rd of the month, 12 days before the Reed hearing. She had known it was coming since Tuesday. The Haskell mare had gone through the changes in the order they always went, the small sequential signals that Ruth had been watching for since January, each one documented and timed, so that when the mare began her restlessness on Tuesday evening, Ruth had been able to tell Silas with reasonable confidence that they had approximately 36 to 48 hours. He had looked at her, then at the mare, then back at her, and nodded with the expression of a man who has stopped being surprised by how much she knows. Wade knew without being told. He simply appeared in the barn on Wednesday evening without explanation and stayed. The three of them worked through Tuesday night and Wednesday night. Ruth slept in the tack room in 2-hour increments, waking at intervals to check the mare, and each time she came back, Silas was awake, and Wade was present, and the barn was quiet, and the mare was progressing in the slow, unglamorous way of laboring creatures everywhere, without drama, with great effort. The foal came wrong. Not dangerously wrong, wrong enough. She presented with her head turned back against her left shoulder, the position that prevents delivery and escalates to crisis if not corrected. And Ruth understood what was happening before the mare fully understood it herself, which gave her approximately 4 minutes of advantage. She did not hesitate. She did not explain what she was doing, and nobody asked her to explain, which was the particular grace of working with people who have learned to trust your competence in the moment and save the questions for after. She worked with her hands and with the knowledge in her hands, the knowledge from Indiana and from Dodge City and from 2 years of watching Eleanor Marsh do things with her hands that should not have been possible and were, and she corrected the position, and the foal came. She was dark bay, almost black in the first minutes, wet and folded and very new. A white marking on her left shoulder. Not large. The shape of a teardrop or the shape of a question mark, depending on your angle. She stood within the hour. Silas was at the stall door and he said, "There she is," in the voice of a man who had not let himself want this outcome and now had to relearn how to hold it. Ruth heard what was under the surface of those 3 words, and thought that 3 words carrying that much weight was its own kind of eloquence. Wade was on his knees in the straw, coat open, hat off, the particular quality of a man stripped of the small protective layers he usually kept in place, present in the full unguarded way that he reserved for the things that mattered most to him. He looked at the foal. Then he looked at Ruth, who was still crouched at the stall's edge with her coat sleeves rolled up, and her hands in need of washing, and her hair come loose from its pins in the hours of the night's work. He said, "You knew what you were doing, and the words were not about tonight specifically, or not only about tonight. They carried the weight of everything from November to this specific cold morning, the entire sequence, and she understood that he was saying, 'I have watched you, and I have understood what I was watching, and this is what I think of it.'" She did not look away from the foal when she answered, because the foal was still finding its legs, and she was still watching to make sure, but she said, "Yes, I did." and let it carry whatever it needed to carry. By morning, the foal was nursing steadily. Silas went to the house to make breakfast. Wade stayed at the stall. Ruth washed her hands at the water barrel and leaned on the stall door beside Wade, and they watched the foal in the gray early light coming through the barn's open south slots. The clean, cold winter light falling on a new animal that had been correctly assisted into the world by the right hands at the right time. She thought about the Reed hearing in 12 days. She thought about what Briggs would say and what Silas would say, and what the documentation arranged in its careful sequence would say. She thought about Pruitt in his wool vest and his beaver felt hat and his patient systematic method for acquiring things that did not belong to him. And she thought about the specific nature of patience, how it was a virtue or a weapon depending on who was using it and to what end, and how she had her own version of it that had been developing since Thomas died. The patience of a woman who had lost the thing she had organized her life around and had spent 3 years reorganizing. That kind of patience did not run out. It refined. She looked at the foal, still slightly unsteady, learning the specific arithmetic of 4 legs against the earth, and she thought about a name. She had not been asked to suggest a name. It was not her operation. She had not suggested anything. But she thought about a name anyway. The way you think about things that are not yet yours to think about, but that you are going to think about regardless. She thought, it will be a good name. Whatever it is. Because names given by people who understand what they are naming carry the weight of that understanding, and what had happened in this barn in the past 3 months was worth naming carefully. On the afternoon of the hearing date, the 14th, which was a day before the 15th, and which Reed had granted after reviewing the scope of what was being brought, Ruth sat in the study and looked at the stack of documentation one final time. Not to check it. She had checked it until checking was no longer useful. She sat with it, the way she sat with finished things, the way she had learned to sit with finished things from Thomas, who had believed that the moment before a thing went into the world deserved its own kind of quiet attention. Everything was in order. Clean copies, sequenced, labeled, referenced correctly. Briggs's written assessment attached to her monitoring records, the 2 documents demonstrating between them the cause and the consequence in language any careful reader could follow. The postal records from Moss. The 1,882 ledger entry in the original hand, with a sworn attestation from Moss that it was authentic. The holding company registration documents, the assignment irregularities. The fire report from the county sheriff's office, which Hayes had opened reluctantly but opened, because the physical evidence Ruth had documented was sufficient to require it, and Silas's statement written in his own hand which he had produced without prompting. 1 page, the facts in order, the date and the description and the horse, witnessed by Briggs and by Wade. She put her hand flat on top of the stack. Let it rest there for a moment. 3 months. From a platform in Rawlins in November wind to this desk in February lamplight. From a woman with 1 trunk and 1 satchel, and a set of skills that did not appear on any official document to the person who had put this stack of papers together, and knew every word of every page, and could defend any of them from any angle. She was the same person she had been in November. She had not become different. She had just been given enough room to operate, which was all she had ever needed, and she had found it in a place she had not expected to find it, which was approximately how most things that mattered had come to her. She picked up the stack, straightened the edges, set it in the leather case Briggs had lent her for the transport to the courthouse. Tomorrow, she thought, everything we have built will either hold or it won't, and either way it will be out of my hands and into the hands of facts and law, and a man named Reed, who has been adjudicating the truth of this county for 12 years, and will not be unequal to the task. She thought this and believed it, which was not the same as certainty, but was close enough to move forward on. She snapped the leather case closed. Outside the study window across the yard, the barn was lit from within by the evening lantern, a warm rectangle of yellow in the February dark, and in the near pasture the Haskell mare was standing at the fence in the cold, with her foal pressed against her side. The foal already learning the landscape of its mother, already learning to navigate the world available to it, with the specific confidence of a creature that had been well started. Ruth looked at them for a long time. Then she turned and picked up the leather case, and went to make sure everyone was ready for the morning. The 14th of February arrived without announcement, no ceremony in it. The light came up the same gray it always came up in Wyoming winter. pressing over the eastern ridge with the indifference of something that has been rising over that ridge for longer than anyone on the ground could calculate and intends to keep doing so, regardless of what the day contains for the people below. Ruth was dressed before the light was full. Dark wool skirt, fitted vest, every button straight. Her best boots, the ones she kept greased through the cold months because they were the only pair she had, and the only pair she needed if she kept them right. Hat seated where it needed to be. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the east wall and saw exactly what she intended to present to Rawlins, which was a woman who knew what she was carrying into that room, and had no uncertainty about her right to carry it. She went to the barn before coffee, before anything else. The Haskell mare stood calm in her stall, the foal pressed against her flank in the nested way of young things that have already learned where warmth lives and do not intend to be separated from it. 11 days old. Dark bay coat gone slightly less black as the birth wet dried out, the white marking on her left shoulder visible even in the early gray. Ruth stood at the stall door and did not touch either animal. She just looked. Let the looking be what it was, which was a woman taking one moment before a large day to remember what the large day was for. She went in, made coffee. The others came in sequence. Silas first, with the appetite of a man who had decided the best preparation for public speaking was to eat enough that nervousness had no room to operate. Briggs next, carrying himself with the self-containment she had come to associate with men who had spent decades being the calmest person in rooms that needed one. Wade last, coat already on, hat already seated, moving with the conserved quality of someone holding something back for when it would be needed. They ate without performing conversation. This suited everyone. They left Cold Ridge at 8. The road to Rawlins was iron hard, and the horses found their footing without being managed, which was what good horses did. And Ruth held the leather case on her lap with both hands and felt through the leather the weight of what was inside it, which was not heavy in any physical sense, but was the kind of weight that makes itself known regardless. The courthouse room was half full when they arrived, and 3/4 full by the time Reed came in, which was not what she had anticipated in its specific composition. Margaret Morrison in the second row with her husband. 3 men from the livery and the feed operation, who had no contractual stake in this hearing, and had come anyway, which meant they had an interest of a different kind, the kind that accrues in small towns where everyone's business is eventually adjacent to everyone else's. And in the far corner, a young man with a notebook and a coat that had come from Cheyenne, whose attention had the pointed quality of someone paid to pay attention. She had written to that newspaper 6 weeks ago. She had not known whether the letter would produce a correspondent in the room or a column item filed from a distance. It had produced a correspondent in the room, which was better, because a man in the room saw what a man at a desk reading a letter could not see, which was the specific quality of how people sat and what their faces did and what the silences between statements contained. Pruitt arrived at 20 minutes before 9 with Aldecott, his Denver lawyer. Aldecott moved through the room with the practiced neutrality of a man who had appeared before courts that made this one look provisional and considered the gap in scale a minor inconvenience he was prepared to overlook. He set his case on the opposing table and surveyed the space without expression. Pruitt sat beside him. Beaver felt hat placed on the table before him, dark wool coat, the grooming of a man who understood that appearance was its own argument. He looked at Briggs, at Silas, at the young man with the notebook, and something moved through his expression at that, quick and contained, the calculation of a man who has just understood that the room is not configured the way he expected it to be configured. Then he looked at Ruth. She was already looking at him. She held his gaze with the same quality of attention she had brought to every problem since November, direct and level, and without performance. And she thought, you built something patient, and you built it carefully, and it took you 2 years, and it is going to come apart in the next 2 hours, in front of everyone in this room. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt the particular steadiness of someone who has prepared for something difficult, and is now simply present for it. Aldous Reed came in at 9. And the room found its attention. He sat, arranged his papers with the deliberate economy of a man who considered his time a finite resource. He looked at both tables and said what needed to be said about the nature of the hearing. And then he looked at Wade, and Wade stood. Wade told it the way she had suggested he tell it, in sequence, without embellishment, the language of a man who has learned that the truth does not require decoration to be the truth. The contract, the terms as understood, the 6 horses, the payment sent August 1st, the receipt in his hand, the letter from Denver claiming the 4th and triggering what had not been triggered. He sat. Ruth stood. She had thought about this moment across many nights, not rehearsing it, because rehearsal was for people who were uncertain about what they were going to say, and she was not uncertain. She had thought about how to be in the room, the specific quality of presence required. She stood the way. She stood in the barn when she was working, weight forward, neither deferential nor combative, the posture of someone doing the thing they are supposed to be doing, in the place they are supposed to be doing it. She handed Reed the postal routing record first, the Carbon County delivery log showing August 3rd, not the 4th, authenticated by a contact at the Cheyenne postal office through Henry Moss. She said 3 independent records establish August 3rd. The supplier's log, produced by the party for whom a 4th of August date creates financial benefit, shows the 4th. She did not editorialize. She let the arrangement of the facts do what arrangements of facts do when they are correct. She handed Reed the 1882 ledger entry, the elder Callister's handwriting, the same delivery date dispute, the same documented correction. The underline beneath confirmed, she said. This pattern predates the current parties to the contract. It is not a clerical error. It is a method. And she watched Reed look at the entry and then look at her, and then look at the entry again. The specific sequence of a man encountering something that reorganizes what he thought he understood. She handed him the holding company registration, October 1884. She handed him the assignment documentation and Moss's analysis of its procedural irregularities, each one identified specifically, each one explained in language that Reed could follow without legal training, because Reed had 12 years of practice, following the language of documents that had been constructed to obscure their own meaning. She gave him the arson report, filed by Hayes, describing the physical evidence, the burn pattern, the oilcloth, Ruth's written account attached. She said, the timing of this incident, 11 days after the holding company's demand letter arrived, and 8 days after Cold Ridge submitted its contest to this court, is a documented fact in the record. Aldecott objected. Reed acknowledged it without sustaining it. Aldecott objected again, same result. He sat back with the professional composure of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time without letting the recalibration show. Briggs stood. He gave his credentials in 1 sentence. He described the sample analysis in 3. He described the mechanism of ammonia accumulation in sealed barn environments during cold months in language, precise enough to be accurate and clear enough that Margaret Morrison in the second row leaned forward without appearing to notice she was doing it. He said, the pattern of respiratory deterioration documented in the Cold Ridge monitoring records is consistent with environmental cause and inconsistent with communicable disease, because communicable disease does not resolve in a 9-day window, following only environmental correction. He said, I have seen this once before. Laramie 1876. The cause was identical. The solution Mrs. Calloway implemented was identical. And the difference between Cold Ridge Ranch's living horses and its dead ones is the specific intervention she designed and executed in November of last year. Aldecott was on his feet. Reed's hand came up. Aldecott sat. Silas stood last. He held his hat in both hands and looked at Reed and not at the room, the posture of a man who knows where his attention is most useful and puts it there. He said what he had seen on the night in October. In the sequence it had happened without editorial. The sound, the dark figure at the hay storage shed, the horse at the far fence, liver chestnut, white stockings. He said he could not say with certainty who had ridden that horse. He said he could say with certainty what he had seen. He said, I kept a sample of that hay because something about it troubled me. He said this the way he said everything, flat and final, as though keeping the sample had been the obvious response of any careful person to a troubling thing, which for Silas Monk it had been. He sat. Reed looked at Aldecott. Aldecott presented what he had, which was the supplier's delivery log showing August 4th and the legal validity of the assignment clause and the procedural correctness of the holding company's formation. He was thorough. He was professional. He was working with what he had been given, and what he had been given was not enough. And the room understood this before he finished, in the specific way rooms understand things that have become clear, not through any single statement, but through the accumulated weight of everything that preceded it. Reed set his spectacles on his papers. He looked at the two delivery records side by side, the Cold Ridge receipt, the postal routing log, the supplier's log from Denver. He looked at Silas's statement. He looked at Briggs's written assessment. He looked at the 1,882 ledger entry for a long time, longer than he looked at anything else, because it was the thing that changed the shape of everything around it, the evidence that this was not a mistake but a practice. He put his spectacles back on. He said, "The default claim is not valid. The August payment was received on the 3rd. The penalty clause was not triggered. The outstanding balance under the original contract terms is within Cold Ridge Ranch's ability to service on the existing schedule. The assignment to the Territorial Holdings Company carries procedural irregularities that do not alter this determination in the holding company's favor. The foreclosure action has no legal basis and is dismissed." He paused. The room was very still. The stove in the corner was still burning, but no one was paying attention to the warmth anymore. Then Reed said, without looking at either table, looking instead at some middle distance that contained his 12 years of sitting in this room and everything those years had shown him, "I have adjudicated contract disputes in this county since 1872. Some of them were disputes about contracts. Some of them were disputes about other things that had put on the clothes of contract language, because contract language was available and other language was not." He picked up his pen and set it down again. "The documents in this case characterize the matter adequately. The record will reflect what the documents show." He gathered his papers and went back to his office. The room exhaled, not loudly, not with any single identifiable sound. But the quality of the air changed in the way it changes when something that has been held in is released, and Ruth felt it against her face and stood still for a moment and let the morning settle into what it now was, which was different from what it had been 2 hours ago in a way that would not reverse. Pruitt stood before Aldecott did. He picked up the beaver felt hat from the table and placed it on his head and buttoned the top button of his wool coat. He turned to leave. He passed the table where Ruth stood with the leather case and he looked at her, not briefly, not the glancing look of someone moving through a room. He stopped and looked at her directly for one held moment, and what was in his face was not anger and not admiration. It was the recognition of a man who has correctly identified where the damage to his plan originated and is filing that information for whatever comes next. She looked back at him with the same quality of attention she had held all morning. She did not look away. She did not add anything to the look, no triumph, no warning, just the steady presence of a woman who had done what she came to do, and was not finished standing in the room she had done it in. After a moment Pruitt moved, and Aldecott followed, and they went out into the February cold, and the door closed behind them. What followed in the room was the specific social rearrangement of people who have witnessed something and are now deciding how to incorporate it into how they understand the place they live in. This happened quickly in Rawlins because it was a small town, and small towns had efficient mechanisms for this kind of processing. Margaret Morrison came forward first, which told Ruth something about the woman that the store counter had not fully shown her. She came with the directness of someone who has revised a position and intends to act on the revision without making a performance of the revision itself. She said, "You did well today, Mrs. Calloway." Not an apology, because she was not a woman who apologized with words when she could apologize with changed behavior. But it contained what it needed to contain, and Ruth understood it. Ruth said, "Thank you for being here." And she meant the specific thing that the words said, which was that the room being full when they arrived had mattered, had changed the texture of the morning in ways that were real even if they were not in the record. One of the men from the livery said something to Wade that Ruth did not hear, but she saw Wade's face when he heard it. The particular quality of a man receiving something he has needed for a while from a source he respects, and she looked away to give him the privacy of receiving it. The correspondent from the Cheyenne paper found her near the door. He asked his questions economically. She answered what the facts supported and directed him to the court record for the rest, which was where the facts now lived permanently, which was exactly where she had intended them to live. He spelled her name correctly in his notebook. She checked without appearing to check. Briggs shook her hand with the formality of a professional whose respect had been produced by observation rather than assumption. He said he intended to write the case for the veterinary journal he contributed to, the details anonymized, the methodology available for practitioners who encountered similar presentations. She said she did not object. She said she thought careful documentation of what had worked was among the most useful things anyone in their respective positions could contribute. He said, "You documented it. It already exists." He put on his hat and walked out into the cold with the bearing of a man who had traveled a significant distance to do a specific thing and had done it. Silas was the last person standing in the room besides Wade and Ruth. He waited, which she had not noticed him doing, till the room was empty enough to notice. He stood near the door with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with the expression she had spent 3 months learning to read, which was his version of everything a more expressive person would have taken a paragraph to say. She said, "You kept the sample," he said. "Seemed right to." She said it was. He put his hat on and went out. She and Wade stood in the empty room with the stove burning and the mid-morning light through the single south window, making a pale rectangle on the floor between the 2 tables. She looked at the tables, both cleared now, both just furniture again, and she looked at the chair where Reed had sat, and she looked at the window. "He'll find another approach," she said. Not prediction exactly. Just the knowledge of what kind of man Pruitt was, the patient, systematic kind for whom a specific defeat was not the same as an acceptance that defeating was possible. Wade stood beside her with his coat on and his hat in his hand. Let him find it. His voice had a quality she had heard building toward this for weeks, the quality of a man who has been in a defensive position long enough that finding the offensive position available comes with a particular kind of release. Whatever he brings next, we'll have today behind us. The record exists. The room full of people saw it. The newspaper will print it. He paused. He built 2 years of patience into what he built. We took it apart in 3 months. She thought about what those 3 months had contained. The loft ladder in the dark. The 4 ventilation slots she had cut herself with Silas holding the board steady. The 9 days of watching and waiting and the bay mare eating for the first time in 3 weeks. The ledgers and the penalty clause, and the letter to Moss, and the letter to Briggs, and the fire in the January night, and the bucket of water she had worked through until the burning stopped, and her hands shook with something that was not cold. The foal arriving wrong and then right. The leather case and its contents laid out on Reed's table in the sequence she had established, each document earning its place. She had come to Rawlins in November with 1 trunk and 1 satchel, and a set of skills that appeared on no official document. She was leaving the courthouse in February with a court determination that would be in the permanent record of Carbon County, her name in it, her documentation cited as the basis for the finding, her word against the word of a well-funded systematic operation, and the court's considered opinion that her word was better supported. She picked up the leather case. "We should get back. The mare needs her midday check." They went out. The February air was cold and bright, the sun actually visible today for the first time in a week, low and white in the southern sky, throwing shadows that were longer than they would be in any other month. The main street of Rawlins went about its business around them. Horses at posts, a woman crossing with a basket, 2 men in conversation outside the telegraph office, who paused when Wade and Ruth came down the courthouse steps and watched them pass with the particular attention of men who had heard what had happened inside and were incorporating it. Neither man spoke, but they watched, and the watching was its own kind of statement. Briggs's horse was already gone from the post. Silas had brought the buckboard around and was waiting with the patience of a man who would have waited indefinitely without an evidence of it becoming less comfortable. They climbed up and drove out of Rawlins and back toward Cold Ridge, and nobody said much because the morning had said what needed saying, and adding to it would have been like talking through the end of something, in order to avoid feeling that it had ended. The investigation Hayes opened into the arson in early March moved the way official investigations moved in Carbon County, which was not fast, but it moved. Hayes came to Cold Ridge to take Ruth's full statement at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, and he wrote it down in his careful official hand, and he took the oilcloth she had kept in the leather case since January. And at the end he looked at his notes and then at her, and said he would be in touch. She believed him, not because Hayes was especially motivated by the situation, but because the arson report and Ruth's documentation had been entered into the court record at the Reed hearing, which meant it was now publicly associated with the Hay contract finding, which meant Hayes opening the investigation, and Hayes closing it without result, would both be visible to anyone who cared to look. And the Cheyenne paper had given people a reason to look. The article ran on the 20th of February. It was factual and organized and named the Territorial Holdings Company. It described the hay supply pattern and the veterinary analysis, and the postal record and the court's determination. It did not name Pruitt. Every person in Carbon County who read it knew who it was about. This was the specific mechanism of accountability in small places. Not the pointed finger, but the description so accurate that the finger was unnecessary. Pruitt attended the county board meeting on the third Tuesday of March, as he always attended it. He sat where he always sat. He participated in the county's business as he always participated. The men who sat beside him had been in Reed's courtroom on the 14th of February. They conducted the meeting with the particular careful courtesy of people who are in a room with someone whose position has shifted and have not yet decided how to name the shift out loud. The business was conducted. The meeting closed. Everyone went home. He did not come to Cold Ridge in March. He did not send anyone. Whatever his next approach was going to be, he was taking his time with it, which was consistent with who he was. And Ruth was taking her time with being ready for it, which was consistent with who she was. And in the meantime, Cold Ridge Ranch was running. The books were improving in the consistent, unspectacular way that Ruth had learned to value more than dramatic improvement, because consistent things compound. And the Haskell mare's foal was in the near pasture every afternoon in the thin March light growing into her legs. Floyd and Burkett Dawes rode in on a Wednesday in the first week of March. Two men on horseback who knew where they were going because they had been there before. They shook Wade's hand and nodded at Ruth and went to find Silas. And within the morning they were working as though the winter's gap between their last day and this one was simply a night's sleep rather than 3 months. This was the specific quality of people who were reliable, that they picked up exactly where things had been left without requiring the world to explain itself to them first. The breeding schedule for spring took shape over 2 weeks of evenings at the study desk. Wade brought the decisions and Ruth brought the financial analysis of each one, and they worked through it together in the way they had learned to work through things, each contributing the specific thing the other did not have, without either one performing deference or authority. The Haskell foal was at the center of the spring calculations, her bloodline, and her projected development and what she would represent to buyers in Colorado and Nebraska in 2 or 3 years, if she continued as she was beginning. She was continuing as she was beginning, leggy and certain of herself, learning the pasture fence line by running it repeatedly in the afternoons, which was what young horses did when they were healthy, and the world had not yet given them a reason to be cautious about the edges of their available space. On a Tuesday evening in April, Ruth was transferring the winter's financial records into the new ledger she had established in January when she reached the breeding register. She had set it up herself in November, the columns she had determined and the categories she had organized, and she had left the foal's name column blank because the name was not hers to give. The column was not blank. Wade's handwriting. The careful, deliberate hand he used for records he intended to last. In the column beside the foal's dam line and sire line and date, Millbrook, she sat with it. Millbrook, Indiana. The town her father had kept his horses in. The town she had grown up in and left at 19 and carried with her in the specific way you carry the place that made you, not in nostalgia but in bone. She had mentioned it once, on the road from Rawlins in November, answering a question about where she had come from before Dodge City. One sentence. The kind of detail released into a conversation without expectation that it would be retained. He had retained it. He had held it through the winter, through everything the winter had contained, and he had put it in the only kind of record that outlasted any single person's memory, the permanent record of the breeding register, where it would be read by whoever came after and would mean whatever it meant to them, but had been placed there by a man who knew exactly what he was placing and where and why. She did not go to find him. She sat at the desk with the register open and the lamp burning and the sound of the ranch settling into its evening around her, and she let the name be what it was, which was a thing given without terms, the kind of gift that trusts the recipient to understand it, without the giver standing there to watch the understanding happen. She understood it. She closed the register and went back to the ledger and finished the column she had been working on, because the ledger needed finishing, and the name would still be in the register when she was done. It would always be in the register now, That was the nature of what he had done. The evening was warm. Warmer than February had suggested April would be. The early warmth of a plain spring that arrives with more conviction than the preceding winter seems to warrant. She took her coffee to the porch. The near pasture held the Haskell mare and Millbrook, the foal 4 months old now, moving through the long amber light of late afternoon in the specific unhesitating way of something that has been correctly started and knows it. She heard Wade's boots on the porch boards behind her. He came to the railing and leaned on it with his coat open and his hat on, and he did not ask whether she had found the register entry, because he could see in how she was standing that she had. He looked out at the pasture. They stood there a while. The light went from amber to the long copper of true evening, and Millbrook came to the fence line and looked at the house with the alert curiosity of a young creature that has not yet decided what the world contains but is not afraid of investigating. Silas came out of the bunkhouse and looked at the sky the way he looked at the sky every evening, checking the weather, finding it acceptable, going back inside. From the bunkhouse Floyd and Burkett's voices came, low and indistinct, the sound of two people at the end of a working day being easy with each other. Wade said, "You found it?" She said yes. He was quiet. She was quiet. The foal moved away from the fence and back toward her dam in the unhurried way of a creature with no reason to rush. She said, "It's the right name," he said. "I thought so." Another quiet, but a different kind than November's quiet, than December's, than the long, careful quiet of two people who have been hurt before and are moving slowly on purpose. This was the quiet of people who have come through something together and are standing on the other side of it and do not need to narrate the crossing, because they were both there for all of it. She turned to look at him. The direct look she had stopped withholding, the one that showed what she actually saw when she looked at him, which was a man who had built something worth keeping and had kept it, and who had noticed the name of a town she mentioned once on a November road and had put it in the permanent record. She said, "The arrangement suits me." He looked at her, both layers, both visible, and she let them be visible without cataloging them because some things lost something in the cataloging. He said, "It suits me." And then, because he was a man who said things in the way that earned their place and not in any other way, more than suits, she turned back to the pasture. Millbrook stood at the fence again, as though she had returned to check whether the people on the porch were still there. She was still there. They were still there. The light finished its crossing, and the first stars came out over the eastern ridge, and the pasture went from visible to suggested in the soft dark, and the mare and the foal were shapes in it, and the ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet at the end of days that had been what they needed to be. Ruth stayed until the pasture was fully dark. She stayed because staying was a choice, and she made her choices deliberately, and staying was the one she made. She did not say anything else, neither did he. But when she finally turned to go inside, he was still at the railing, and when he followed her in a moment later, she heard the porch boards under his boots and the door close against the April night, and the lamp in the hallway made the house warm and specific and real. And outside in the dark, Millbrook stood in her pasture, learning the edges of the world available to her and finding them, on this particular night in this particular spring, more than adequate, which was, in the end, all any creature reasonably asked.